Chapter 130. Scene 59, The Last Night of Brags, Part 1. No matter what. The setting sun of Aween had sowed the seeds of its internal strife. King Oberg VII gradually realized that he was getting old, and that his strength was not as great as he wished. He was eager to clear the way for the new king to ascend to the throne, so he could not help but take action. After all, his greatest threat was the two rebellious duchies in the south of the kingdom. Brando knew that King Oberg VII ascended to the throne at the age of 93. This king had great ambitions when he was young, and he wanted to emulate his grandfather, Anson XI. That was when the militia and guards were first established, and when the central power of Erewhon was at its peak. However, the world was not in his control. Even though Oberg VII had witnessed the arrogance of the local nobles, and the young Duke Erek even threatened his father, Oberg VI, to change the defense laws, these memories left a deep impression in the king's heart. However, he lacked Anson XI's ability to use both kindness and power. Moreover, during Anson XI's reign, Erewhon had no internal or external threats. The royal family could even control the local armies, and the current turbulent times could not compare. In the cold night of Brag's outskirts, the wind gradually picked up. The wind, which came from the sea, followed the path of the northern ridges of the Kalanga Mountains, passed through the hills and mountains of Randner, and carried with it the scents of the woods and the rivers of that long journey, which penetrated deeply into the lungs of everyone on the fringes of the forest. Roman stood barefoot in the water, and she could not help but raise her head and squint her eyes, letting the wind caress her smooth forehead. The smell of the wind here is exactly the same as in Bucci, Brando. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could not help but exclaim in surprise. Amandina also took a deep breath, but she coughed instead. Brando glanced at her and then raised his head, just in time to see the night wind carrying a dark cloud from the west, covering a large patch of stars. It was as if the kingdom's dark future was foretold. Brando didn't feel heavy at all. Instead, there was a kind of excitement that swept through every nerve ending in his body. To him, the impending chaos was also an opportunity. Could he participate in this history and rely on his meager strength to change the heavy and cold history that seemed to be engraved on a stone slab? This was not a fantasy, but a signal to urge him to take action. Brando seemed to have smelled a hint of warning in the air. He turned his head, and there was a faint flush of excitement on his fair face. He asked, "Did you get the money?" Although Cripple didn't understand why a simple piece of news could make Brando go into a daze, he realized that he couldn't see through this young man anymore. At the auction house, he had seen with his own eyes how Brando had killed the powerful spiritual servant. That was not the skill of an ordinary person. Now that he thought about it, he could only attribute it to the fact that he was the descendant of that old thing. He couldn't help but look at Brando again, and then answered with sincerity, "The money is in our hands. Brando, I followed your orders and moved the money to a safe place." "The auction house compensated you?" Cripple was shocked and nodded hurriedly. Brando knew that Bragg's underground auction house was backed by the local nobles. This was an open secret. That was why he wasn't worried that he would suffer unnecessary losses. To these people, reputation and face were more important than money. "How much money do we have in total?" Brando asked. Cripple stretched out his hand and made a count. Excluding the money they used, there were still 2.5 billion tor left. Brando looked at it and saw Amandina walking over with his shoes. He looked at Badam and Amandina, who were sitting at the side, and replied, "That's good too. Our business in Brags has come to an end." In reality, Brando's original plan still had some details to be perfected. For example, there was a quest in the noble's library that allowed him to obtain a low-level skill book. Another example was the quest in the Cross Star, and that gave him a permanent increase of 1 energy rank to the Golden Wine. It was a pity that these quests could not be completed in a day. Brando estimated that it would take him a month to complete them in the game, and it would only be slower here. As a player who strived for perfection, he should have stayed to reap all the benefits. However, the sudden change in the situation in Brags, and the presence of the unifying guild, made him realize that it was not a good idea to stay here for long. As soon as this warning appeared, Brando reacted as quickly as possible. He had already decided to leave this place and head east or south. He would go deep into the mountains of Randner, pass through the Tsandaka forest, and follow the northern ridge of the Karana mountains to search for his treasure. Where are we going? Although Badam was clamoring to leave this troublesome place, he was still a little worried when it came to it. Even though he was a mercenary, the furthest he had gone was Karsuk. But according to Brendel's explanation, they might have to cross Randner and reach the shores of the Sea of Stars, where they would be able to see the towering mountain that the poet spoke of. Following that path, they would have to enter the wilderness. Legend has it that after passing through the Tsandaka forest under the mountain, or following the Silver Beach to the east, there would be an endless desert. The people of Karsuk lived here for a long time, and in their stories there were some countries to the east of the desert. For example, the most famous legend, the Land of Pearls, the Kingdom of the Nine Phoenixes. We will split into two. Badam, you will bring Cripple back to the group, and let Redo bring everyone to a place called Gree. To get there you will need to hire a guide. The safest route for now is the road to the north of Randner. Nominally, you only need to use the banner of a mercenary to not cause any trouble. Brando thought for a while and replied, Gree, where is that place? That is the easternmost port of the kingdom, Brando smiled. The scenery there is not bad, and the local girls are simple and warm. Badam, you might find a girl you like there. Badam blushed and muttered, I am a mercenary who is always wandering, my lord. That was in the past. Now you are my retainer. Brando did not mind at all. The red-bearded mercenary immediately shut his mouth, but his face showed a look of yearning. Even if he was a little reluctant before, he was now eager to give it a try. What about you, my lord? He thought for a while and asked again. I have some personal matters to attend to. Brando thought of the Thorn of Light that he had lost in the auction house and felt it was a pity. However, that sword had gradually lost its luster after reaching level 20, so it was necessary to change to another weapon. In fact, his equipment and strength did not improve at all in the past month, which was a far cry from his original plan. Of course, Braggs's preparations were necessary. As the saying goes, sharpening the axe will not delay the work of cutting firewood. Brando's actions were already fast enough, but he was not satisfied with it. Especially after his encounter with Turst, he felt the need to increase his strength. Therefore, at that time he had made a mental note of this adventure. His goal was still the Dusty Kingdom, but before that, he had to verify the words of the White Knight Ebden. Brando did not dare to let his guard down when it came to the Lionheart sword. However, he needed to use the Sage Slate to make the Stone Sage speak. Brando did not have any hopes for the Sage Slate that would reach Braggs in a few days. Putting aside the fact that he did not have enough time, he did not have the money of 500,000 Tor right now. But it's fine. I'll just go and get a Sage Slate. He knew that there were a few dungeons in the game that would drop it. The closest ones were Randner, Grinoires, the Misty Forest at the border of Erek, the ruins of the Necromancer's Temple, and the Dragon's Canyon. These places were suitable for him to go on an adventure at his level, and he only needed to prepare a little. Brando also knew that he needed to increase his strength, and this was killing two birds with one stone. Brando said that he had personal matters to attend to, so Badam did not say anything. His thoughts had already flown to Gree. Brando's description of that place made his heart itch. He had never seen the sea in his life. Brando turned back and asked, Roman, what about you? What are your plans? Are you coming with me? Or are you staying behind to take care of the celebration? Romaine tilted her head and answered as if it was a matter of course. Of course I'm going with Brando. But the light in her eyes clearly said that she was going to take the risk. Roman was going to take the risk. You're not going to earn money? Brando was surprised and could not help but touch her forehead to see if she had a fever. Of course not. Roman slapped his hand away and said proudly, Lord Roman has already arranged everything here. I've already handed it over to Sue, and the rest is just waiting for the funds to come in. Sue? Brando was stunned. He remembered the girl who looked at him with a cold face, and felt like he owed her 1,000,000 Tor. Isn't that the Redo's daughter? Yes. Roman nodded. She's here to look for Freya. I'm Freya's best friend, so of course I can ask Sue for a little help. You're really not worried about people. Brendel could not help but smack her on the head. This action had become a habit for him recently. Roman immediately smiled like a little fox. If that's the case, I'll stay as well. Amandina suddenly said. This is part of my job anyway. Brando stopped and looked at her. You can't stay. Mother Marcia above. Amandina and the future master alchemist Tamar are the most valuable assets I have right now. He could not leave these two people in Bragg's no matter what. He had to take them with him for safety's sake. Tamar had to bring his heavy alchemy equipment, so he could only let him go with Reto and the others. And in the spirit of not putting all eggs in one basket, he had to let Amandina go with him. If Roman was with him, at least there would be another girl who could take care of Amandina. Terst is still here and you know his identity. The Unifying Guild is not an ordinary person. It's too dangerous for you to stay here. Come with me and I'll let Roman take care of you. He thought for a moment and replied, How can I do that? Amandina was stunned. She had a trace of yearning for an adventurous life, but she knew that she could not adapt to such a life. For a girl like her, adventuring was just a beautiful dream that existed in her dreams. Some people would follow their impulsive thoughts, but Amandina was not such a person. But just as she began to hesitate, Romaine's words shattered her reservations. Of course you can, Amandina. Adventuring is very interesting. Amandina could not help but look at Brando. Brando nodded. There's no need to say any more. Everyone go and prepare. We'll split up and enter the city. I'm afraid that Terst will come looking for trouble again. Before the last star disappears, we'll gather at the East Gate. Everyone nodded in agreement. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 131. The heavy wooden door with gilded patterns slowly opened. The air started to move, and a low rumbling sound pierced through the eardrums. It was as if an ancient kingdom was opening its doors to visitors. The light outside the hall gradually became brighter. Behind the door stood a girl with an angry expression. The half-elf princess was wearing a silver-white princess dress. The hem of the dress was fringed with flouncy leaves, and it reached all the way to the marble floor. She held her head high and her chest puffed out. Her silvery curls fell over her shoulders, and her hands were crossed on the lining of her dress. She stood there with a cold expression on her face as she stared at the people who were slowly walking out from the shadows. The deep marble floor set off her beauty. She was like a lily blooming in the dark. Your Highness. Marquis Kluge, who was walking at the front, had a surprised smile on his gloomy face. This important minister who had served the house of Covardo since Nan's era put his hands under his ribs and bowed deeply. He raised his head and his lips curled up slightly. His thin face seemed to always have a trace of a mocking smile. You're welcome, Marquis. The girl did not even look at the old fox. She looked straight ahead and asked coldly, Is father inside? I'm sorry, Your Highness. His Majesty is receiving the ambassador of Madara. I'm afraid he can't see you for the time being. Kluge replied with a smile. Erwin's eldest daughter had a worried look on her face, but she quickly recovered. Then I'll wait here. She raised her head and replied, It's late. The ambassador of Madara won't stay for long. Your Highness, please take care of yourself. Marquis Kluge looked at the proud flower of the royal family. His eyes were filled with admiration, but he still had a fake smile on his face. Thank you for your concern. Then I'll take my leave. Please. The girl's pale silver eyes did not move as she watched these people leave. But when Marquis Kluge, who was wearing a purple gold official's robe, passed by her, the eldest daughter of Erwin suddenly said, Marquis Kluge, you're playing with fire. You're on your own now. Marquis Kluge was slightly startled. The princess' words carried a serious warning. The trusted minister of King Oberg VII stopped in his tracks and thought of something. A gloomy smile appeared on his face. Your Highness, what are you talking about? He asked. You know what I'm talking about. I can't stop what happened in the city of Brags and Fort Corco, but don't forget whose side the Holy Cathedral of Fire is on in Erwin. The princess replied coldly. Kluge's expression changed slightly, but he quickly returned to normal. This old fox was extremely shrewd. He took a deep breath and replied with a fake smile. Thank you for your reminder, Your Highness. Neither side seemed to be willing to continue the conversation. Marquis Kluge and his entourage left in a hurry. A young man behind the Marquis asked, "Lord Marquis, what does she mean? This flower of the royal family can't be underestimated, Wilma." Marquis Kluge replied with a gloomy face. "Although we're in a good situation now, she's not idle either. According to the news from outside, this princess is using the Church of Havel to raise money. Although I don't know what she wants to do, I'm sure she'll make a move." Marquis Kluge turned his head to look at the dark night sky outside the arched windows of the corridor and said, "Today, she's here to remind us of this. But if she can do this, it means that our princess still has some concerns. She's afraid of breaking the vases." He sighed and rubbed the ring on his glove. On the pitch-black ring tray, an Ouroboros seemed to have come to life as it coiled around the tray, its edges reflecting a faint bronze light. Everyone was silent. The half-fairy princess watched Marquis Kluge and his entourage leave without saying a word. When she turned back, she saw Sir Benninger in a light golden robe walking out from the shadows behind one of the pillars in the hall. "How is it?" The girl waited for him to come closer and immediately asked. The young man shook his head bitterly. "Not good, Your Highness. I still haven't seen His Majesty." The girl's face became calm. "Your Highness, tonight I'm going back to my territory. Take Hazel with you and come with me." The girl stared ahead and replied calmly, "Be careful, don't attract the attention of those people." "Your Highness, is there no other way?" Benninger asked with a bitter face. He was the youngest son of Duke Cypher and had an extremely high status. But ever since he met Princess Grafine a year ago, he was shocked by her beauty. Since then, he had submitted to the charm of this half-fairy princess and was willing to follow her everywhere. Benninger had stayed in the capital for longer than a young nobleman expected. His father had sent him letters urging him to return home and inherit his fief, but the young man still lingered in the capital, forgetting to return home. Everyone knew that the one who held this young man's heart was only the eldest princess of the Erewhon royal family. Princess Grafine turned 16 in July, which was the age for the royal family to talk about marriage. However, Oberg VII loved her very much. He would rather have her accompany him for 2 more years. Besides, Oberg VII also understood that his youngest son, Hazel, was a coward and needed the help of his sister. However, this was actually a good thing for Benninger. He knew deep down that there was no possibility between him and the princess. The longer she stayed with Oberg, the longer he could stay with her. Of course, it wasn't that he didn't feel sorry for himself. If he was the eldest son of Duke Cypher instead of the youngest, things would be different. But now the girl's words made his heart beat faster. The princess said that she wanted to return to her territory. This was a great opportunity. In the history of the Erewhon royal family, there weren't many cases where a direct descendant of the royal family returned to their territory, but every time they did, something terrible would happen. Benninger looked at the princess, his heart filled with anticipation and fear for the unknown future. He couldn't decide what to do. He felt that if they left, it wouldn't be just a simple storm in Erewhon. Under the dim candlelight, the 16-year-old Erewhon royal princess's firm gaze contrasted with the young man's hesitant expression. The hall was silent for a moment. "What are you worried about, Benninger?" "I have some worries. His Majesty, The young man didn't know how to express his thoughts. In fact, ever since June, or to be exact, ever since Madara's envoy arrived, other than Prime Minister Kluge, none of Oberg VII's trusted subordinates had seen him. Even his daughter and son were forcefully grounded, and their movements were limited to the royal capital. The news of Oberg VII's house arrest spread like wildfire, but it didn't cause much of a reaction among the nobles. Ever since Oberg VII appointed Kluge as his prime minister, his trust in him grew day by day. Kluge's faction held a lot of power in the royal court, which was a fact that everyone knew. However, this faction never had any contact with the local government, which was why Oberg VII trusted them so much. As a result, the royal faction allowed them to do as they pleased. Kluge's administration and strategy were impeccable, and he was hailed as the greatest politician of the Corvado dynasty since Anson XI. Some people even compared him to Poix, the Archbishop of the Church of Havel during the time of Anson XI. However, the situation took a turn for the worse after 4 or 5 months. Kluge seemed to have the intention to seize power, And with the War of the Black Rose raging like wildfire, Erwin's internal politics seemed to be in a precarious situation. However, doubts and suspicions didn't only spread among the nobles. However, the core figures of the royal faction, Oberway and Everton, were on their way to deal with Madara. The only remaining figure of the Church of Havel, the most prestigious of the three, was also in seclusion. As a result, the situation in the royal capital seemed to be even more gloomy. However, at this time, the eldest daughter of the royal family of Erwin proposed to return to her own territory. Not to mention whether or not they could escape from this big cage. But how could this princess bear to leave her father behind? The relationship between Princess Griffine and her father was recognized by the world. Benninger, as a close vassal of the princess, knew this better than anyone else. However, the half-elf girl's expression didn't change. She replied quietly, "With my father's personality, he would never agree to such a ridiculous agreement with Madara. Although I still don't know what Kluge's goal is, one thing is clear. We can't do anything here. First of all, I have to send my brother out. This is one of my responsibilities. I have to be one step ahead. Everything is for the benefit of the royal family. If anything happens to my father, I think he will understand. Your Highness." The young man stared blankly at the half-elf girl who was a head shorter than him. It was as if she wasn't 16 years old, but a mature and outstanding politician. Griffine glanced at him and said, "Don't worry, Benninger, I am not unprepared. With the help of my teacher's connections, we can still play our own game. Don't forget that I have never trusted Kluge. They wouldn't dare to harm my father." The princess suddenly stopped talking. She saw the gloomy face of Madara's envoy walk out of the door. At this moment, the living and the dead looked at each other. Then they passed by each other. However, when Erwin's royal capital was in a state of chaos, Brando, who was well aware of this, was sitting leisurely in the Cross Star Bar in the White Swan district of Brags. He was asking the bartender about the golden wine. Every once in a while, he would look at the wind-up clock hanging on the wine rack. It was almost 12 o'clock. Brando didn't expect to be lucky enough to get the clue of this continuous quest overnight and complete it easily. He was just waiting for someone and looking for something to pass the time. When the church's bell rang 12 times, the door of the bar was finally pushed open. Outside the door stood a girl wearing a dark blue military uniform. Her long ponytail was tied behind her head. Her face was slightly red, and she looked at him with a light brown and bright eyes. Freya seemed to be an official knight. She was wearing a formal knight's belt and a cross-hilt sword issued by the church on her waist. She also wore a pair of shiny riding boots. She looked like a heroic female knight. However, her concerned expression betrayed her. She looked around as soon as she entered the bar, and her eyes fell on Brando. She took a deep breath and immediately asked, "Are you leaving, Brando?" "Yes." Freya was silent. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 132. Freya fell silent. She seemed to be thinking absent-mindedly for a while, then raised her head to look at him, her light brown eyes deep like a pair of brown gemstones. The young knight raised her left hand, hesitated for a moment, and then took off the ring on her index finger. "Brando, wear this ring. Outside, you need it more than I do." Brando was slightly startled. He looked at the fireball ring, the bright ruby shining under the candlelight. He then looked at Freya, who turned her head slightly and said, "This ring originally belonged to you. I'm just borrowing it temporarily, have you forgotten?" At this time, the bartender who had been chatting with him stood up and patted the young man's shoulder, smiling. "Buddy, looks like you're in a bit of trouble. I'll go do something first. I'll tell you about the legend of the wine glass later." After saying that, the bartender picked up the glass and walked to the other side of the bar to deal with a few drunk mercenaries. The young knight with a long ponytail saw this scene and could not help but close her mouth subconsciously, unable to say a word. Brando shook his head and smiled, but the faint smile on his face could not hide the warmth in his heart. He looked at Freya, once again feeling the weight of the word partner in his heart. He had originally only left a message for Freya, but he did not expect this stubborn girl from the countryside of Bucci to insist on seeing him after seeing the Roman. Of course, He knew that she did not come just to give him the ring, but to show her concern for him. Freya's heart was in a mess. She clenched her fists. When she first heard that Brando and the others were leaving, she only had one thought in her mind. Even if she ran out of nowhere, she just wanted to see everyone. That feeling was like a child who could not leave the adults. After calming down, she only felt her face burning. She had been thinking about this problem. She wanted to go to Erwin's Royal Cavalry Academy alone, leaving everyone, especially Brando. Could she really do what Brando said to her? He had the power to protect little Ferris and everyone else. Freya felt that her heart was filled with uncertainty and doubt about the uncertain future. Brando was like a life-saving straw in front of her, but when it came down to it, she didn't dare to reach out and grab him tightly. The female knight stared at the corner of Brando's clothes in a daze. Of course, Brando saw through her thoughts, because Freya's thoughts were written all over her face. He smiled and reached out his hand to take the ring. The female knight was slightly stunned. She raised her head and asked, You accepted it? Of course. How could I refuse a ring from the goddess of war? Brando laughed. However, he knew in his heart that Freya wouldn't encounter any danger in the Wangli Knight Academy. Moreover, he really needed every bit of strength he could muster. If that wasn't the case, he definitely wouldn't have accepted this ring just to make Freya feel at ease. Valkyrie. In my hometown there's a story about the Valkyrie. The legendary Valkyrie was heroic and cool. She sat on a warhorse, holding a swallow-tailed flag in one hand and a long sword in the other, leading her people to victory. She protected her country. Brando looked at her and smiled. He was thinking about another Valkyrie's story. At the end of the First Era in Wonde, there was a lady on a warhorse, wearing silver armor, and looking at her subordinates with sparkling light brown eyes. Brando remembered that the background was the gray sky of Fort Mar. The broken flag of the Silver Cross Army was hanging weakly on a spear. The female general was riding her beloved horse, Silver Sand. She was shorter than many warriors, but she wasn't much taller than Freya now. At that time, she still had the long ponytail that she had tied behind her head since the Bucci era. The brown ponytail that made people feel warm on the battlefield represented a name that could be relied on. It made everyone feel at ease because that was Freya, Erwin's protector, the Valkyrie. At that time, Freya lowered her head and looked at each of them. She rode her beloved horse in a silver battle robe and slowly walked past each of them. It was drizzling. Her only subordinates were only 100 or so students from the Royal Knight Academy. Many of them were the children of great nobles, and some of them even became their most troublesome enemies. But at that time they were all following behind the female knight. A group of knights in white battle robes followed her all the way into the eyes of these defeated soldiers. When depression, despair, and abjection shrouded their hearts, every player lost their confidence. Erwin was finished. This ruined country was no match for the powerful Madara. They felt sorry for themselves, shook their heads, and sighed about why they were born in such a country. There was no hope, no tomorrow, only the humiliation of failure. But when these young knights appeared, it was like a pure light, like a sharp sword that slowly parted the gloomy clouds in the sky. Brando would never forget that scene for the rest of his life. The female general's first words were, "Soldiers, please turn back and join me. Let's defeat Madara. Please forgive me for not being able to understand your cold, hunger, fear, and pain at this moment, but I can see a deep abjection in you. This abjection, I can feel it, because at this moment our country has failed. We will retreat, and the undead will sweep our homeland. We are the losers no matter how we quibble. We can't choose all of this. This depression suffocates us. Is this really the only thing we can do? Soldiers? No, please turn back. But at least we still have a chance. Let me take you with me to fight again. Please believe in me." She pressed her hand on her chest. "I will fight side by side with you. I am willing to take all the responsibility for this. Follow me, let me die in front of you. Let me use this promise to exchange for the courage of a man." That was the first time the silver lily shone on the battlefield. The legend of the Valkyrie was written into a poem in Erwin that touched countless players. Speaking of this protector of Erwin, perhaps compared to most NPCs, the players had a deeper impression of this name. Because it was she who brought them out of the fate of failure, gave them glory, and made the name Erewhon a source of pride. She was their flag, the source of pride for the players of Erewhon. They were willing to fight for her because each of them was willing to fight for their own honor. Erewhon's war song was composed by an ordinary player who was not famous on the forum, but it was sung by countless people. We are the proud people of Erewhon. Even if we fail, we will not lower our noble heads. Our courage is engraved on our swords. Our faith is the flag that protects us. The blood of Erewhon flows on the path that we yearn for. What we yearn for. There will be a day when the silver lily flag is raised again. What we yearn for is the belief of Erewhon never to be broken. When we die, the voice of our souls still echoes on this land. It is telling. This is our homeland, the land that we love dearly. Brando lowered his head and rubbed his eyes. When he raised his head again, he saw Freya lowering her head and whispering to him. How can I do the same thing as the legend, Brando? I am a very stupid girl. I just want to do my best. Yes, your best is the root of this legend. The young man looked at her. He admired this kind of serious Freya. Even if it was a small matter, this girl from the countryside of Wuxia would do her best to do it. Maybe she did not know what kind of potential she had, but there will be a day when gold shines from the sand at the bottom of the river. He smiled. Just think of it as a dream. Freya looked at him, nodded, and asked, Is it the legend of the Highland Knight? Brando nodded. Freya was silent. After a while she whispered, Is there anything else you want to tell me, Brando? No, wait. Brando hesitated for a moment, then called out to her. He thought for a while and asked, Freya, what do you think of Erewhon? When Brando said this, he deliberately lowered his voice. In fact, his eyes had already swept across the bar to see if anyone was paying attention to them. Erewhon, what do you think? The girl was stunned. If the country is compared to a person, Erewhon is now like a dying old man. Brando replied. Freya was stunned. In this period of time, she was no longer the naive female militia captain. After seeing the filthy relationship between the nobles, she was full of worry for the people in the upper class who controlled the fate of the country, but she did not understand where the problem was. Was it supposed to be like this? Or did something go wrong? The uneasy girl could only comfort herself that in this world, there was light and there was darkness. Maybe everything would be better. This was just a cycle of history. But in the depths of her heart, she always wanted to know if it was just her naive view of the world in the past. But she did not expect that the first sentence Brando asked her to stay would eliminate all the comforting thoughts in her heart, leaving only the worst one. For a moment Freya was speechless. Freya, listen to me. Brendel hesitated for a long time before saying that. He was always worried that he would affect the goddess of war's future path. But in the end he made up his mind. Because Freya was not only the goddess of war, she was only a shadow in his heart. She was more of a partner that he could trust. He had no real family in this world, and Freya also lost her parents who raised her. In comparison, the two of them needed each other's support more. In fact, ever since that night in the Green Village, Brando understood that his connection with the goddess of war could not be broken. It was like two lonely, weak people relying on each other to move forward in the darkness. Brando found it hard to imagine that without these people in Wuxia, he could establish a connection with this world and not feel lonely all the time. And for the current Freya it was the same. Erewhon may not be able to return to the peace of the past. Only a great change can save this country. Of course, a great change may also tear it apart, but every one of us in this era can only do our best to save it. I don't know how many people can see through this. I don't know how many people can understand what I mean, but Freya, do you understand? The female knight looked at him in a daze, but nodded subconsciously. Do you now understand why I want you to go to the Royal Knight Academy? But Freya, do your best. I don't know if this is true, Brando, but I want to believe in you. Freya took a deep breath and said uneasily. But my mind is in a mess right now. I only feel scared. What about everyone in Wuxia? Do we not have a way to change everything? So I will also do my best. Freya, I need your help. The girl looked at him and stopped. What should I do? If anything happens, we'll support Her Highness one-sidedly. I heard that Princess Griffine of Erewhon has a good reputation. If there is anyone in the Corvado dynasty who can lead this country out of this predicament, we can only trust her. Brando thought for a moment and replied, At the Royal Knight Academy, I believe you will have a chance to meet her. Brando, why do you know so much? Freya could not help but ask. You are joking with me, right? I also want to, but when you unconsciously become a chess player, whether you like it or not, you can see the big picture. You will understand in the future, Freya. Brando smiled. Don't worry too much, we will all meet again. Freya, don't forget what I said, I will stand behind you. The night girl lowered her head and thought for a moment before whispering, I understand, then I will leave. When Freya said those words, she was as lonely as a solitary bird. When she turned around, Brendel had the urge to call out to the girl who came from Wuxia, but he resisted in the end. Freya had her own path and he could not be so selfish. But at this time the girl stopped and turned around. Brando. Yes. Please take care of Roman for me. She is my best friend. After saying this, she walked out of the bar without looking back. Brando was left alone, trying to figure out the meaning of her last sentence. But in the end, the young man just shook his head and picked up the wine glass on the bar counter. P.S. Sorry, there are too many things happening this year, so I don't have the face to say too much. I'll try my best to write more chapters. Chapter 133. The late summer breeze had a hint of sweetness to it, and it was intoxicating under the warm sun. August had passed and October was approaching. The young man reached out his hand towards the blue sky, and his fingers covered his vision. The gentle sunlight flowed through the gaps between his fingers, and the changing rays of light were exceptionally beautiful. Then he sighed and put down his hand. The green mountains of Chablis once again returned to his sight. The air was dry and comfortable, and the weather was clear and pleasant. However, the deep green that covered the mountains had faded a little. Ginkgo, metasequoia, and platanus trees had a layer of light yellow on their leaves, and the fragrant trees in the forest were dyed a light red. The mottled colors were like oil paint that flowed into a palette, and when they blended together, it created a natural beauty that made one's heart flutter. He sat on the back of his horse and held the reins with one hand. He stared at the grayish-white cliff not far away from him. At the intersection of the mountain and the river, there was a red roof. That was the town of Chablis. Chablis was not famous in the game, and Brando only knew that it was located in the middle of Ranner. There were a few minorities in Erewhon living there, the mountain folk. There was a dense forest to the north of the town, and the ruins of the Silver Elves were hidden under layers of trees. It was called the Barragonis Gurlis Ruins, and it used to be a spacious temple for the Silver Elves. The silver courtyard was built in the middle of the dense forest, and it was connected to a sacred white corridor. It fit the philosophy of the Silver Elves, and it was a mysterious and majestic beauty. However, during the year of the Shadow Dragon, the elves left the area for unknown reasons, and the temple was abandoned. Now, it should be occupied by a group of lizardmen bandits if Brando remembered correctly. In the game, there was no background in this area, and the reason why the players went to the Silver Elves temple was to plunder the wealth of the lizardmen bandits. Of course, the game designers gave them a more dignified reason, and it was mostly to get rid of evil for the people. Brando felt that it was ridiculous. The players did not need any excuses, but the game designers had to find ways to make the world self-consistent. Thus, they had to find a reason to help the locusts in the game. It was just that other than the plot, it was a thankless task to begin with. But now his thoughts had changed. He realized that the background that he didn't understand before was now shrouded in fog. Brando had never been to Chablis before because there were more than 100 dungeons like the Balagan Jurlis ruins in the old Grimoires region. Players did not need to risk their lives in other regions when they were still at low levels. The game designer's thought process was also biased towards this direction. Once players reached a higher level, they would be able to move freely between regions and countries. However, as a veteran player, he had more or less heard rumors about these areas. For example, the ruins of the Basilica of St. Jurlis in Chablis where the lizardmen bandits resided, the weathered tomb of Leviathan that was filled with traps and undead creatures, and the floating city of Carousel where the players fought against the mayflies. Every one of them was an adventure story of wealth and treasures against the shadows of swords. Brando did not expect that he would have the opportunity to visit these places when he was collecting information. But at this moment he stood on top of a hill and looked down at Chablis. Smoke rose from the rooftops like slanted lines before dissipating into the air. Fortunately, I didn't have the intention to take advantage of the situation, or else I would be in a daze right now. He thought about the Basilica of St. Gerlis and the lizardmen bandits. Chablis is as beautiful as described in the forums. It's so peaceful that I want to leave my heart here forever. It's like a calm harbor. The Roman walked out from the forest with her beloved pony. She bought it from a merchant who sent Count Ranner to Bragg's, and she was reluctant to ride it. She curiously looked at the mountains and rivers of Chablis, and her dark eyes flashed with excitement. "Brando, is this the place?" she asked. "Yes," Brando replied and nodded. "This is Chablis." The name Chablis was left behind by the Silver Elves in the past, and it means sweet mountain range. Seems that we are quite lucky. The undead of Madara did not pass by here, and this place is as peaceful as before. But it's not strange. Incersta's army would definitely choose to march to a more prosperous place. The reason why Sir Black avoided Bragg's was to let Count Ranner take advantage of the situation. Of course, he wouldn't come to this remote Summerleaves Hills for no reason. Moreover, these were stories that happened in history, and Brando was confident. "Are there any snacks in Chablis?" Romain immediately asked. "You can try the mountain people's hot pot." Brando turned to look at the girl he loved and smiled dotingly. "But ever since we left Magiton, little Roman has become more and more gluttonous. Be careful not to get fat." When Roman heard this, his pair of small eyebrows immediately stood up. He hurriedly explained, I won't get fat. I'm just eating a little, that's all." But it sounded like she was comforting herself. She secretly used her hand to measure her waist, and her eyebrows furrowed. It was as if she could not decide between eating good food and getting fat. "Sir Knight, do you have the sage's slate you mentioned?" Amandina was riding on a black horse with a glossy coat. Her face had gradually become rosy, and was no longer as pale as the first time she met Brando. Even though the journey was tiring, at least she did not have to worry about her next meal every day. There was a long scroll box tied to her horse's back. Not only was it the crystallization of her wisdom and her most precious treasure, it was also the priceless treasure that Brando valued the most. The reason why he insisted on bringing Amandina along was because of the lines drawn on the parchment. The girl coughed twice, raised her head to look at the clear sky and murmured, "It's almost October. Don't worry, there shouldn't be anyone who will beat us to it this time." Brando knew what Amandina was asking. They had left Bragg's for more than a month, and the news of Erwin and Madara's truce had spread to every nobles in the south by the end of the 8th month. At that time they had just arrived in Ranner's territory, and first settled down in the capital of the Count's territory, the city of the forest, Magiton. Brando placed his hopes on the sage slate in the misty forest west of Magiton, but it was obtained by the local Church of the North Wind just like in the game. Brando and Count Ranner's Knight of the North Wind did not have much of a relationship, and after staying in the area for a while, he could only leave. But when he was in Magiton, he introduced the Roman to the most famous local snack, a honey dessert. As a result, Amandina was now full of interest in the local snacks. Brando could not help but smile when he thought of this, but he suddenly remembered the matter of the coup in December. There were still 2 months. He knew that he would not be able to make it in time, but he could only leave it to the future regent princess, and the girl from Bucci, Freya. Freya should have already arrived at the Royal Knights Academy in the princess' private territory, but he did not know how tense the situation outside was. But there was a limit to a person's strength, and he did not have the capital to participate in the game between the nobles. Brando's biggest task at the moment was to continuously strengthen himself, and when he mentioned strengthening himself, he could not help but think that Reto and the others should have already entered the Erech province. "Are we going to look for the sage slate here?" Amandina asked. "Yes, there is a ruin of the Silver Elves to the north of here, and it is rumored that the sage slate is in there," Brando replied. He wanted to find a guide. He knew the background of this area like the back of his hand, but because he had never been to Chablis before, he did not know the exact location of the Balagon, St. Gerlix. But there was a group of lizardmen bandits in the ruins, and it would not be as easy as he thought. In the game, the Balagon, St. Gerlix was a level 23 dungeon. Even though it was much lower than the Forbidden Orchard of the Golden Demonic Tree, there was no shortcut to it. He thought for a moment and decided to first enter the town. The three of them walked down the mountain and entered Chablis in less than half an hour. In fact, the town of Chablis was different from most of the towns in the south of Erewhon. The mountain dwellers built this town in the middle of the mountain, and it was not a simple matter. They followed the wisdom of their ancestors and piled up stones to fill up the slope, so the new parts of the town were always stacked on top of the old parts. Over time, the entire town was built up along the river at the foot of the mountain, and it looked like a stone fortress. If one had to describe the town with an impression, it would be stairs. A large number of stairs that intersected with each other. The buildings were arranged side by side on the platforms. Narrow and slender stairs connected the platforms that were staggered in space. This place still maintained the primitive appearance of Aween's southern mountains, and the mountain people rarely used magic. They built stone lampposts on both sides of the stone steps, and placed braziers in the hollowed-out areas to replace oil lamps or magic street lamps. Brando remembered that there was only one bar in Chablis, and it was called Chablis Lantern Grass. This was the name of the Chablis players in the forums, and it was because of this reason that he remembered this legendary inn. It was said to be a legendary inn because it was the home of all the adventurers, mercenaries, and players in Chablis. Its appearance was like a large hall, and the guest rooms were at the bottom of the hall. Usually, travelers would gather in the hall above to exchange information. There was only one such inn in the whole of Aween's southern border. Amandina and Romain did not notice anything on the way into the town, but Brendel's sharp senses immediately picked up a trace of unusual aura. On the horse he looked around carefully. The people who were dressed differently from the traditional clothing of the surrounding mountain people were passing through the streets in twos and threes. Most of them were in the prime of their lives. Some of these people even cast suspicious glances at the three of them. Brando immediately recognized these people. They were travelers, adventurers, mercenaries, and monster hunters. These people could appear anywhere in the Wonde, but for a small place like Chablis there were too many of them. This was not the same Chablis that had a large number of players in the game. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 134. Yes, these adventurers have been here since a week ago. No, to be more precise, they are mercenaries. Amandina replied calmly. Brando looked at her in surprise. Amandina found a trace of satisfaction in his surprise. My Lord Knight, are you surprised that a noble's daughter who never leaves her house has the ability to deal with these matters? She turned around and asked. I'm just curious about where you learned your skills. You know that this is the reason why Highland Knights are trained. Indeed, a noble's daughter who never leaves her house is able to speak freely in front of others, and it's enough to make people look at you in a different light. Brando patted the Roman's shoulder to prevent her from wandering too far away from the sights. Unexpectedly, the Roman comforted him. Brando, don't worry, I won't get lost, she said. For a moment, Brando was speechless. He could only look at the Roman with an embarrassed expression, and wondered what kind of structure was in her brain to make her thoughts so different from others. Fortunately, Amandina helped him out of his predicament. Socializing is an instinct of a noble's daughter, my Lord Knight, she said humbly, but it was not difficult to hear that she was secretly happy. Brendel was taken aback for a moment before he laughed. Not every noble lady can put down her status and interact with a country bumpkin. He was not wrong. In Erewhon, the Highlanders were considered vulgar country bumpkins in the eyes of the nobles. Even the lords of the Highlanders could not get along with the lords of the Northern Empire. For example, the two important ministers of Anson's 11th era, Duke Hernandez and Duke Longblade, often mocked each other in court, causing even Emperor Anson to have a headache. Because I'm different from them. I'm just a poor girl, my lord. Brando laughed and shook his head. These mercenaries must have come to Chablis at this time of the year because of the bandits in the forest. Erewhon often raises money to hire mercenaries to wipe out the bandits entrenched in villages and towns that affect people's daily lives. This has become a common practice. He walked along the paved streets of Chablis and brought the topic back to the main topic. In densely populated areas, the ones who hire these mercenaries are mostly the local police or militia. In remote areas, a village will pool all its money to pay for these mercenaries. Amandina was taken aback. She had never seen such a description in books before. There's such a thing? It was the same in Wuxia in the past, the Roman also paid for it. The Roman answered without turning his head, poking his head out of the narrow roadside with great interest, and gazing down at the crisscrossing streets. Only in places where there are guards would the guards be used to dealing with the local bandits themselves. Thus, it is not unreasonable for the royal family to place their hopes in their new army. Indeed, the guards represent a new force in Erewhon, but I don't know if this force will have the chance to grow. Moreover, there will only be one generation of them that can be used. Brando raised his head and said deeply. Amandina lowered her head and began to think about some things again. At this time, Brando and the other two heard a shout from behind them. Stop right there! The three of them were startled and turned around, but they realized that the shout was not directed at them. They first saw a young man rushing through the crowd and hurriedly running past them. However, before he could run a few steps, he was stopped by two mercenaries in front of him. The two mercenaries pulled out their swords and blocked the young man's path. Eek, where do you think you're going? You bastard, have you forgotten the rules of our mercenary band? The young man was slightly taken aback and could not help but look around in panic, but he realized that there were mercenaries in leather armor surrounding him with shining swords. In fact, Brendel happened to be at the edge of the encirclement, but no one noticed him, and he was happy with it. He pulled Romain back a step to avoid being involved in this inexplicable battle. Capo, what are you trying to do? The young man called Eek realized that all of his escape routes were sealed and stopped to catch his breath. He immediately pulled out a short sword from the scabbard and wiped the sweat from his forehead as he asked nervously. You know what you've done? A mercenary wearing a gray robe walked out from the crowd and looked at him coldly. Otherwise, why would you choose to run away today? Have you forgotten the oath you made when you first joined the mercenary band? Our leader and the others treated you like a brother. But why would you betray us? The young man was stunned for a moment and showed a struggling expression. Capo, I didn't betray you. The mercenary named Capo looked at him carefully and sighed. Come back with us and we'll naturally believe you. The young man shook his head. No, Capo, please don't ask. I've said it before, we can't go to Balagon Forest. He hesitated for a moment and shook his head. Please trust me this time. Trust me, I won't harm you. Think about the past, how could I betray you, betray everyone? Enough, Eek. The mercenary showed a pained expression and interrupted the young man. No matter what, you have to come back with us and return to our leader's side. If you have anything to say, go back to the camp and our leader will listen to your explanation. Eek, listen to my advice. Our leader raised you, and if you leave here, you'll be abandoning him and your comrades. He pointed at himself and the others. Do you see that? These are your comrades. What are you trying to do? The young man hesitated for a moment but took a step back in the end. Don't say any more, Capo. This time, I'm clear that I'm the one who's right. I won't go back with you. Furthermore, I have to stop you from going to that place. I don't know what to say. He looked around and saw that the other mercenaries were getting closer and closer to him. He couldn't help but beg. Capo, on account of our relationship, let me go. Believe me, I won't let you regret this, I swear. Brando? The Roman saw this scene and couldn't help but ask softly. My lord? Amandina also turned her head. Faced with such a situation, the two ladies asked the only person they could rely on at the moment if they wanted to leave for a while. But Brando shook his head and looked at the young man with a thoughtful expression. On the other side, Capo saw the young man's determination and knew that it was useless to say anything more. He took a step back and signaled to his men. The mercenaries immediately rushed forward from all directions and sealed off every path of retreat for the young man called Eek. In fact, Brendel was taken aback when the mercenaries made their move. He immediately realized that these mercenaries were not weak at all. Some of them were even as strong as Leto, which meant that they were at least mid-level iron rank. Even though most of the mercenaries who roamed the outside world had some reputation and strength, Brando was still surprised to see so many powerful mercenaries in a small place like Chablis. Not only Brando but Amandina also noticed this. She wanted to say something, but she calmed down and carefully observed the scene in front of her. Even though she was just a weak noble's daughter, she was still more knowledgeable than Romain and Freya, who came from the countryside. But what shocked Brando even more was the young man. Under the encirclement of 7 or 8 iron-ranked mercenaries, he calmly lowered his center of gravity and rushed forward, grabbing a mercenary's sword with one hand. The youth's movements were so fast that Brendel almost did not see it clearly. He only saw a flick of his hand, and the mercenary was thrown over his shoulder and fell to the ground. Then he leaned to the left, and another mercenary was sent flying. His direction was exactly where Brando, Roman, and Amandina were standing. Brando was stunned. Normal people would not be able to withstand the force of this collision. The young man was at least a silver rank. He seemed to be 2 or 3 years younger than Brando, and he could not help but sigh. As expected of the chaotic times, monsters appeared one after another. The first person he saw when he came to this world, little Phyllis, was an outstanding talent. Breton, Irene, Freya, and that Viscount Terce were all outstanding talents. In normal history, there were only a few of these people in a generation. But just from Bucci to Brugloss, these small places, he had already seen a few of them. It had to be said that in the chaotic era after Vaunt, there were indeed some predestined factors in the unseen world. Of course, thinking was just thinking, but his hands were not slow. He used explosive strength to catch the mercenary who was about to crash into him, and then held him up. Brendel almost lost his balance and took a step back. He could not help but exclaim in his heart that the mercenary was too strong. Perhaps the iron-rank mercenary would not be affected by this collision, but if it was a passerby, even if he did not die, he would be seriously injured. But he thought that if he still had the Thorn of Light, he would not have ended up in this situation. But this young man is really reckless, he thought. The mercenary who was knocked dizzy finally caught his breath. He turned around and looked at Brando in surprise. He probably did not expect a random passerby to have the strength of an iron rank. He was stunned for a moment before he realized that he should thank Brendel. "Oh, thank you, sir." Brando shook his head and interrupted him. His gaze was still on the small battlefield. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 135. On the battlefield, another person flew out in a short period of time. The young man seemed to have taken down 3 mercenaries in the blink of an eye and opened up a gap in the crowd. Before anyone could react, he had already broken through the gap. However, the direction he chose surprised Brando because the leader of the mercenaries, Capo, was already waiting in the young man's path. The old mercenary held his sword horizontally and leaned forward with his mouth tightly pursed. He looked like a beast that was about to attack. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that this posture was from Master Swordsman Emeria's Swordsmanship, Lantern Island Swordsmanship. This swordsmanship was named after the famous sword saint. It was spread throughout the continent in the early years, but it had already declined during this period. Due to the complexity of the swordsmanship, there were very few people in this world who could master this swordsmanship and use it to fight against their enemies. However, almost all of these people were experts. In the game, Brando remembered that Emeria's swordsmanship required 133 EXP to upgrade from level 1 to level 2, which was 60% more than the average middle-level swordsmanship. Although the accuracy of this swordsmanship was twice that of the military swordsmanship, and the damage correction was 1.3 times, there were not many players who would spend time and effort on this swordsmanship. This was because the market price of this swordsmanship was as high as 1.3 million tor. Only a few countries' museums had rare copies of this swordsmanship. The young man called Eek seemed to have realized his mistake, but retreating at this critical moment was an extravagant hope. He could only grit his teeth and charge forward. Although he did not have a sword in his hand, it was obvious that he had a foundation in swordsmanship. He was using Muax Knight swordsmanship. Brando could tell from the small movements of the young man that he was using. The two of them were from the same mercenary group and seemed to have a good relationship. However, the swordsmanship they used was from different places, which was quite interesting. However, this situation was not very rare, so Brando only paid attention to it subconsciously. At this moment, the young man was charging towards Capo. He was trying to change his path to avoid Capo's swordsmanship. Unfortunately, Capo didn't disappoint Brando. With 2 clean swings of his sword, he sealed off the young man's path, forcing him to jump to the side. At this moment, Capo only needed to take one more step forward to cause the young man to panic. At this moment, Brando's true strength was probably not a match for either of them, but he knew this better than anyone else present. As expected, he saw Capo take a step forward and step right in front of Eek. He held his sword in his hand and prepared to use the hilt of his sword to finish off Eek. However, at this moment, Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Capo's movements were half a beat slower, and the young man managed to grab onto his arm in the nick of time. Then, the young man's entire body slammed into Capo's chest, causing the old mercenary to stumble back 5 steps. This turn of events was out of everyone's expectations, and even the young man was stunned for a moment. Brando could clearly see a trace of astonishment in his eyes. However, Eek immediately shook his head and glanced at Capo, who was pushed back by him. It was only for a split second, and he immediately fled into the crowd without looking back. What a guy! Brando exclaimed in his heart. This mercenary called Capo was purposely going easy on him. However, his method was really well hidden, and normal people wouldn't be able to see through it. If it wasn't for the fact that he had accumulated a wealth of experience in the game, which was unimaginable for people of his age, he would probably be kept in the dark as well. He had almost 110 years of experience in using swords, and he only had a little more than 10 years of experience in using other weapons. As a veteran warrior who had spent more than 140 years in the game, some of the basic things were as simple as eating and drinking to him. His current strength was only at the upper middle level of a black iron rank, and he might not be a match for the young man called Eek. However, if they were to really fight, even 2 weeks wouldn't be enough to take him on. Especially after a month of adventuring, Brando's mercenary level had already reached level 16, and Erwin's military swordsmanship had also reached level 9+1. Combined with Brando's memories of his grandfather, his swordsmanship was no longer comparable to that of the young man from Wuxia. It could be said that among the regular soldiers of the White Mane Army, those slightly older swordsmanship instructors were only good enough to be his students. Brando's swordsmanship wasn't at the level of his grandfather, but there were traces of similarities. It could be said that he had the demeanor of a swordsmanship master. Of course, a true swordsmanship master wouldn't only be proficient in one skill. But because of this, the more Brando leveled up, the more he felt that his grandfather was mysterious. That old soldier who had over 100 experience couldn't even summon the will to fight when he drew his sword. Was he really just a veteran of the November War? At least, he couldn't see the same thing from Reto, who was also a veteran of the November War. Of course, Reto was a soldier who participated in the later stages of the war, while Brando's grandfather had experienced the entire war from the beginning to the end. This was probably the biggest difference between them. He couldn't help but recall who the candlelight badge of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had been given to, but he couldn't remember who they were. Back then, he had more dealings with Erwin's officials, and later joined the Holy Cathedral of Light, so he didn't have much interaction with the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This thought just flashed through his mind. The scene froze for a moment because of the sudden change of events. Most of the people looked at each other, but the sound of voices first came from the surrounding residents. The people began to discuss the gains and losses of the previous battle. Even though most of them didn't even have time to see how the battle started and ended, it didn't stop them from talking. The mercenaries who were knocked down by the young man got up one after another. The people involved didn't say anything, but they looked at each other and didn't seem to be upset or angry. On the contrary, there was a sense of relief. Brando obviously saw their expressions. He turned around and saw Amandina looking at him. The two of them looked at each other and saw a hint of understanding in each other's eyes. Brando, they don't seem to want to chase at all. Roman stood behind Brando and whispered. Brando smiled and nodded. Captain Capo, are you all right? At this moment, he saw a mercenary walking over to the leader of the mercenaries called Capo and carefully questioned him. Capo looked at his wrist and was stunned for a moment. He then raised his head and spoke to the others with a serious expression. I'm fine. All of you spread out and seal off Chablis. Don't let Eek escape. If anything happens this afternoon, I'll take full responsibility. Oh, all right. No problem, Captain Capo. The mercenaries replied numbly, but their reaction was so slow that it made one's hair stand on end. However, the senior mercenary seemed to have ignored them. He looked around and his gaze finally landed on Brando. It was only now that he had the time to take a closer look at Brendel. Brendel had helped his mercenary up earlier, and he had been observing the entire battlefield. In fact, Capo was startled when he saw Brando for the first time. He did not expect Brendel to be so young. From Brendel's previous attack, he had guessed that Brendel was at least a middle-upper iron-ranked fighter. A young man in his 20s with the strength of an iron-ranked fighter. No matter where he went, people would be surprised. Capo immediately thought of Eek. Eek was the most talented youth he had ever seen in his life. He was the adopted son of their leader, named Wolf Makarov. He was a genius who had unlocked the second tier of strength at the age of 17. In Capo's impression, only the legendary geniuses who were known as the Enlightened One could have such achievements at such a young age. Eek was the pride and hope of the mercenary group since he was young. Even when he selfishly left the mercenary group, Makarov only ordered them to bring him back. Even so, the others didn't want him to be punished because of his selfishness. It could be seen how much he was pampered by everyone in the mercenary group. Capo calmed down a little when he thought of Eek. Brando's youth had become a lot more natural in his eyes. He let out a sigh and walked over. His expression softened a little as he spoke to Brando and the others. "Thank you for your help. You can call me Capo. Mister, may I ask for your guidance?" "Brando, there's no need to be so polite." Brando was also sizing him up. This experienced mercenary leader had a pair of gray eyes. Brando could see that his brows were constantly furrowed, as if he had an endless amount of worries. His melancholy aura coupled with his gray hair made him look like a handsome uncle. His hands were long and slender from using a sword for a long time. If one didn't look at the calluses on his hands, they would look like the hands of a pianist. If such a man appeared on the streets of the world he came from, he would definitely cause a lot of girls to scream. Brando couldn't help but feel jealous. Even though Brando's body wasn't that bad, his experience was still lacking compared to this man's temperament. He lacked the weather-beaten sense of vicissitudes. It seemed like these mercenaries weren't ordinary people, but he didn't know which famous mercenary group they were from in the south. Brendel looked at the man's attire. He could not find any clues from his attire, and he did not wear any obvious emblems to distinguish him. It seemed like they weren't in the middle of a mission yet. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 136. Brando knew the background of the game like the back of his hand. If Amandina's knowledge of this world was limited to the books, then he was a complete veteran. He stared into Capo's eyes. Even though this leader was obviously going easy on him, Brando was still able to determine his strength from the details of his attacks. He was probably above average silver rank. He's almost at the level of a captain in the White Mane Army. He's probably just a little bit weaker than a commander. This shows that this mercenary group is not to be underestimated. Even though Reto's group is just a bunch of retired mercenaries, all of them are above average iron ranked. Brando guessed that they were not much weaker than these people in front of him when they were at their peak. He had asked Reto and his group of friends about their background once or twice, but Reto did not seem to be willing to talk about it. On the other side, Capo felt a strange feeling in his heart when Brando looked at him. This feeling was almost instinctive. He looked at Brendel's pair of dark eyes that seemed calm and bottomless. In fact, Capo had been to many places as a veteran mercenary and had seen many important people. Some of them were nobles in Erewhon, some were merchants, some were from the north, some were from the south, some were from the mountains, some were from the Tower tribe, and some were from the Desert tribe. He had even seen one or two mysterious wizards. But none of them had a pair of eyes that were as calm as this young man's. He had a smile on his face as if everything was under his control. It was an expression that was filled with confidence and confidence. For a moment, this experienced mercenary had the illusion that all of his secrets were known to the other party. He frowned and shook his head to throw this ridiculous thought out of his mind. But he did not know that this was the truth. He did not expect that Brando would be able to see through him just by looking at a few details. In this era, there were not many people who knew Ameria's swordsmanship. Even Capo himself did not know that his swordsmanship came from Ameria. He was only taught by someone when he was young. Not to mention the fact that his strength had been seen through with just 2 sword strikes. It would be too ridiculous if word got out. Unless the young man in front of him was a swordsmanship grandmaster who was hiding his strength, that would be more like it. His gaze landed on Brando's clothes. They were from Bragg's. Even though the clothes of Grimoires were similar to those of the southern Erewhon, they were far from the mountains. Capo was about to speak when he noticed this, but Brando's words were cut in front of him. "You're not from this place, right? Mercenaries?" Brando's gaze passed Capo's eyes. When Brando spoke, Amandina and Amandina's left and right respectively. Amandina was from a noble family and was well educated. She naturally knew that this was not the time for her to speak. However, the future merchant girl seemed to be born with such knowledge. She obediently blinked her eyes and looked at Brando and Capo without saying a word. Capo was slightly surprised. "Yes, you are. We pass by Chablis a few times every year. Even though we're not locals, we're at least familiar with this place. In fact, when I entered the town, I was wondering why there were so many travelers in Chablis." Brando's face did not change as he spoke the non-existent truth. "Until I saw you guys, I just remembered that you're mercenaries." Amandina's eyes flashed behind his back, but her expression did not change. Amandina's little Roman listened with a smile, as if Brando was speaking the truth. It had to be said that Amandina was born with the ability to deceive people. "We're here to exterminate the lizardmen bandits in the forest." Brando's answer was reasonable, and the key point was that he was calm and composed. No one could see any flaws in his words. The experienced mercenaries naturally did not have any doubts and replied in such a manner. Moreover, their reason for coming here was not a secret. However, Capo was still vigilant and didn't continue the conversation. Instead, he asked, "How many times do you pass by Chablis in a year? Sir, you're a merchant, right? If you have any use for our mercenary group, please feel free to call us. We will definitely provide the best service." As he spoke, he turned around to look. "But I'm sorry, we have a small problem here. I'm afraid I'll have to leave immediately. If you have time, I represent my leader to welcome you to our mercenary group as a guest." Brando smiled. This guy was obviously trying to stall for time. He probably wanted to find the young man from before. However, he pretended that he did not see it and put on a sudden realization expression. "I see. That's a coincidence," he added quickly. Capo was about to leave when he heard this sentence. "What's wrong?" "It's like this." Brando smiled and went along with Capo's words. "Actually, I didn't come to Chablis for business. I came to look for something." Capo was stunned for a moment before he stopped with a frown. "What are you looking for?" "It's just a stone tablet with ancient records. It's in the Balagon ruins, and it's in the Silver Elves stone tablets. But as you know, Mr. Capo, the ruins were occupied by a group of lizardmen a year and a half ago. The last time I came to Chablis was 3 months ago to investigate the lizardmen bandits in the forest. This time, I brought a few mercenaries with me and wanted to sneak in to steal the stone slab, but I didn't expect to meet Mr. Capo and the rest of you here." Brendel replied calmly as though there was really something going on. "That's 3 months ago. I came to Chablis to investigate the lizardmen bandits in the forest." Capo was completely stunned. "You're saying?" Brando immediately nodded. "Yes, according to the rules, in order to avoid conflict, I suggest that we use the 314th rule of the Mercenary Code to come to an agreement. How about that? My men and I will temporarily join you and fight alongside you as long as we don't endanger ourselves. After the mission is over, we'll go our separate ways and take what we need. How about that?" The rules of the mercenary world were mostly not written down, but it was enough to settle most disputes. However, the rules between mercenaries and their employers were usually strictly enforced, but disputes between mercenaries would often lead to different opinions. About a century ago, the Adventurers Guild, which was a subordinate organization of the Holy Cathedral of Fire that managed adventurers and mercenaries, had compiled these rules into a code that was commonly used by mercenaries. This code was called the Mercenary Code, and it was a temporary solution to these disputes in the future. This code had been modified, added, and deleted over the past 100 years, and it was now quite complete. However, there were still some unfamiliar terms in it. For example, the one Brando mentioned was a rule that was popular in the northern highlands of Erewhon about 150 years ago, but it was rarely mentioned in this era. That was why Capo couldn't help but be stunned when he heard this suggestion. There's no problem with this code. Capo looked at Brando suspiciously. But I don't have the right to decide. If you're interested, you should go and meet our leader. His name is Makarov, also known as the Maned Wolf. He's in the inn right now, you should be able to find him there. No problem. Brando nodded. Then I'll take my leave first. I won't delay Mr. Capo's business any longer. Capo had already regained his senses and only nodded in response. Brando didn't mind Capo's reaction at all. He already had this thought when he saw these people. Even though the lizardmen in the Balagon forest weren't ferocious existences, it would still be troublesome for him to deal with them alone. However, if he could borrow the strength of these mercenaries, things would be much easier. The sage slate was nothing more than a slate in the eyes of those who didn't know what it was. In fact, in the past, the value of these stone slabs only increased after cross-region missions became more frequent. That was why Brando believed that he had the ability to convince Capo. But who was the leader that Capo mentioned again? Maned Wolf Makarov? Brando paused for a moment before he realized that he had almost forgotten about this important piece of information. So it was the Blue Mountain Mercenary Group. This was one of the 22 most famous mercenary groups in the southern border. But didn't the Blue Mountain Mercenary Group only become famous in the year of spring? That would be 5 years later. He rubbed his forehead and felt a little puzzled. Did he remember it wrongly, or did history change in some way? However, what Brando didn't know was that Capo was also puzzled. Captain, who is that? Capo looked at his subordinate and shook his head. I'm not sure, but he seems to be a local merchant. He seems to be very familiar with our rules. There are 314 rules, but I've never heard of this rule before. It can't be fake, right? One of the mercenaries asked. Capo shook his head. Of course he knew that it wasn't fake. However, he only remembered this rule after Brando mentioned it. This wasn't a big deal as there were more than 700 rules in the mercenary group, and it was impossible for one to remember every single detail. In fact, other than the core 13 rules, most of the rules were just supplementary explanations and weren't as strict in real life. However, the more Capo thought about it, the more mysterious Brando was. He felt that this young man wasn't as simple as he seemed. It's always good to have more people. Someone immediately said. That's not necessarily true. Who knows if they're spies from the other side? That's true. Don't worry. Even if it's temporary, he has to pass the leader's test. A mercenary replied. The leader will definitely send Gabu. Sigh, it's a pity that Eek has this problem. Otherwise, he would be in the limelight again. Speaking of Eek, the mercenaries couldn't help but fall silent. P.S. I originally wanted to write 3 chapters, but I realized that I'm still a little rusty. But no matter what, I'm finally able to catch my breath. I wrote intermittently during the Chinese New Year, and couldn't find the feeling for it. I've only slowly recovered these 2 days. I should prepare to recover and speed up. Sorry for the long wait. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 137. Chablis Lantern Grass Inn was located at the highest point of the town on the east side of the cliff. It looked like the ancient legends where the heroes and gods lived. The wooden hall was built on top of the cliff, and after being exposed to the wind and rain, water had seeped into the sturdy wood and turned it black. Looking down from the hall, there were rows of windows on the gray-white cliff. From afar, this unique scene looked like a huge beehive or a dragon's den on the cliff. But in reality, that was the inn's guest room. The door to the room Makarov the Maned Wolf was staying in was pushed open 15 minutes ago. The experienced mercenary leader raised his head from the map of Chablis. His thick eyebrows twitched when he heard a certain term from his subordinate. His deerskin-gloved hand was still holding onto the magnifying glass with a bronze handle, but he had already opened his mouth and asked, Article 314 of the Constitution? During an official mission, if there is a conflict between the 2 parties shall be merged. Both parties shall be considered as having reached an agreement. The details of the merger shall be discussed by both parties. An old man with white hair and beard sitting on a rattan chair by the window answered. The old man stared at the red book in his hand that was about 4 inches thick and didn't seem to be interested in the topic. Grandmaster Fleetwood, can this rule be extended? Not necessarily, the old man replied. All right, then let me see who that young man is. Makarov waved his hand at the young man in front of his table and said, Go, let Rady test him. But he immediately stopped the young man. Wait, did you find Eek? Not yet, my lord. All right, I got it. You may go. Makarov shook his head and grunted. This time I must teach him a lesson. Seems like I've spoiled him too much. If this continues, I won't be able to explain myself to the Lord. A smile flashed across the old man's face as he read, and he shook his head slightly. You're Brando? I'm Brando. Brando raised his head and looked at the young man who was almost a head taller than him. His hair was a rare pure white, and his eyes were golden like amber. His face was feminine, and he looked like a woman. A Yablis? Brando thought. The only impression he had of this minority was the silver-haired sword St. Gorikis who was active in Wone 30 years ago. He knew that Makarov wouldn't accept his request so easily, but he didn't expect him to send such a young man to test him. To be honest, other than the Enlightened One and the Chosen One, there were very few youths around his age in this era who could defeat him. Level 23 strength of the Iron Tier. Moreover, level 15 was the first threshold for any profession. Once this threshold was crossed, the profession's attribute bonus would enter the stage of level 1 strength to level 2 strength. In fact, even though Brando had lost the Thorn of Light, his strength had increased to level 15, which was 12 or even 13 times that of a trained soldier. Even though he looked like a frail young man, he could easily kill a wild boar with a single punch if he wanted to. As long as Brendel opened his status panel, he could clearly see that his absolute strength had reached a terrifying value of 220. In other words, theoretically speaking, if he were to face any second or third tier army of any country in this world, he would be able to easily slaughter his way in and out of the place. Aween's adventurers usually referred to him as the strength of a squadron leader. Moreover, Brando's hidden strength was far more than that. Just his level 10 Erewhon military swordsmanship was enough to make most of Erewhon's officers and knights blush with shame. Of course, Brando didn't feel that way. He only felt that there was still some distance between him and his grandfather. But before he could finish his thoughts, the young man had already pulled out his sword and pointed it at him. The tip of the sword swayed slightly, and a cold light flashed in his vision. Listen well, merchant. I will never accept a weak challenge, nor will I show mercy. It's the exact opposite. Because the duel between warriors is sacred. It's a battle of swords and swords, trying to end the opponent's life. The white-haired young man said. The commander allowed me to fight you, but I won't go against my will and show mercy. Have you thought it through? Brando turned to look at the Roman. Brando, does he mean that he's stronger than you? Romane's eyes widened. In fact, she was trying to widen them even more. She blinked and asked. No, I don't think that's what he meant. Brando was not angered to death by the Roman, and could only reply in an annoyed manner. My lord. Amandina asked. Brando shook his head. Can't you have a little bit of confidence? But he had already pulled out the sword at his waist. After losing the Thorn of Light, he had been using a normal steel longsword, just like the one in his hand. The white-haired young man looked at his sword and couldn't help but show a trace of contempt. The sword was brand new, as if it was just bought from a blacksmith's workshop. He was not wrong, and the truth was as such, because the previous sword had been shattered in a battle because it could not withstand Brendel's power. Brando raised the sword and waved it casually, as if he was getting used to this new sword. But his actions immediately caused the mercenaries and explorers in the inn to hiss. No swordsman would only get used to their sword before a battle. Brando's performance was like a young boy who had never been on the battlefield before. Rady, isn't your idol the Jacobite sword St. Gorikis? Defeat this young boy and show us your strength. Well said, as a fellow sword saint, you can't embarrass yourself. Rady, do your best, kill him. The mercenaries immediately became rowdy. These lawless people were a group of people who would never know their place no matter where they were. But when Brando heard one of the names, he couldn't help but be slightly startled. Gorikis. He was about to enter the preparation position of Erewhon's military swordsmanship, But he relaxed his mind and raised his head to ask. This distraction caused him to only complete half of his movement, and the military swordsmanship starting position went out of shape. The mercenaries booed again. You don't deserve to mention that name. The white-haired young man's face darkened as he thrust his sword forward. The sword was as fast as lightning in the eyes of ordinary people, but in Brando's perception range of 3.7 ounces it was extremely slow. Moreover, he was attacked before he could finish his sentence. He subconsciously backhanded his sword, or more accurately, he raised his sword and slashed the sword out of the young man's hand. Whoosh! The white-haired young man couldn't hold his sword at all, and it flew out of his hand and stabbed into the ceiling. The young man's sword was deeply embedded into the light black wood, and it was still trembling slightly. The entire hall was stunned. The mercenaries who had been cheering loudly earlier were now dumbfounded. It was as if they had seen a dragon or something else. They opened their mouths in a daze. To be exact, they had forgotten whether they should be cheering or booing. Brando's sword was not elegant at all. To put it bluntly, it was like a barbarian swinging a stick. Because it was not a type of swordsmanship, it was purely an instinctive reaction. But the key to this sword was not its elegance, but its strength. Innate strength? Everyone subconsciously thought of this. This was nothing new. On the road of Vaunt, legend had it that some of the humans inherited the bloodline of the Golden Bloodline, and some were naturally awakened as the Chosen One. But there was another type, they left behind some of the characteristics of their ancestors. For example, they were born with innate strength or strong recovery ability, or they were born with the ability to see elemental power. Generally speaking, this kind of power could only be seen in creatures with golden bloodline, such as dragons, unicorns, and other mythical creatures. But immediately someone shouted, Level 1 strength. Iron strength. The white-haired young man held his wrist and took 5 steps back. He looked at his swollen arm, and for a moment he couldn't accept it. Although he was not as talented as Eek, he was able to reach the lower levels of the iron rank in his early 20s. He was considered one of the best among most people. However, he did not expect that he would not be able to withstand even one strike from a person younger than him. How could there be so many monsters like Eek in this world? Rady was stunned for a moment. But his shock only lasted for a moment, because Makarov and another tall middle-aged man came up from below the inn. Although they didn't see the previous scene, they only needed to look at the swords on the ceiling and the reactions of the people on the scene. This shrewd mercenary group leader understood 80% of the situation. His gaze fell on Brando's head, and he frowned. Even though he knew that the merchant who wanted to join his group was a young man, he didn't expect him to be so young. Buga! Makarov lowered his voice and said to the middle-aged man beside him, You go test him. Me? The middle-aged man's voice had a thick Iraq accent. Yes, I suspect this young man is from paper cards. Makarov stared at Brando and said, Do they have such an outstanding young man? Makarov, aren't you thinking too much? Buga said as he unsheathed the greatsword on his back. But it's fine. Since you said so, I'll give it a try. No matter what, this young man must have some background. Makarov was startled as he turned around to look at his old friend. It's nothing, I just smelled something familiar. The middle-aged man looked at Brando with a hint of doubt in his eyes. P.S. I'm really still writing. Some of my friends' words are warm, and some of them are depressing. Continue writing, I want to rebuild my character. I hope everyone can forgive me for the erratic updates. I'm writing as much as I can, and I'm not slacking off. As for the problem of saving manuscripts, I really don't have the habit of saving manuscripts. Sorry, I only saved a short amount of manuscripts when I uploaded the book, and they were all sent out quickly. Chapter 138. The silence in the hall lasted for a long time. Brendel looked at the white-haired youth who was clutching his wrist in disbelief, then looked at the sword that was still vibrating on the ceiling. He let out a sigh of relief. He was not surprised by this result. After the previous attack, Brando felt that this youth called Rady's strength was about 4 to 5 times that of a normal person, which meant that he had just stepped into the iron rank. It was the same level as when he was in the Golden Demonic Tree Canyon. This kind of strength was considered outstanding for his age, but it naturally could not be compared to his cheat code. Brando thought about his own strength. In this period of history, he had indeed used a cheat code. In a week, he had unlocked the first level of strength. In a month he had entered the iron rank, and in the 3rd month, he had entered the silver rank. Even though it was not comparable to the chosen, it was still unprecedented. As for whether there would be others after that, Brando could not say. According to the game's calculation, the silver rank would start from level 35. Brando estimated that he would need to reach level 40, which was about 600,000 experience points. And he had to store enough experience points in 7 months. Only then would he not miss the last train to Erwin's December Civil War. While he was thinking, he saw the crowd split into 2 sides. Amandina made a small sound of surprise. Brando was also slightly surprised, and then his gaze fell on 2 people at the back of the crowd. The one in front was a man wearing chainmail and a blood-red cloak. He wore a tall hat with colorful feathers on it. He looked like an explorer from Erwin's Royal Geographical Society, but the brooch on his chest was not the Royal Geographical Society's blazing amber, but a simple wooden medallion. The medallion was engraved with a kingfisher. The taller man in the back was wearing simple leather armor. The armor only protected the important parts of his body, so the muscles on his arms were exposed. He was carrying a huge sword that was at least 5 feet long on his shoulder. His forehead was wide, but his cheeks were deeply sunken as if they had been cut by a knife. He pursed his thin lips, giving people the impression that he was not angry, but he was imposing at first glance. When Brando saw this person, he could not help but be stunned. Isn't this that guy? Brando could not help but have a little doubt in his mind. Because of this tall man who looked like a barbarian from the snowy highlands, the moment he saw him, he immediately sketched out an image in his mind. A Rex Crosshand Buga, the trusted aide of Duke Lone, the captain of the guards of Lantern Island Castle. Arek was one of the 3 most famous swordsmen. He was one of the great swordsmen on par with Devard the Eagle and Sylvia the Silver Knight. Brando knew this guy because he was a famous character in the game in the past. As the guard captain of Lantern Island Castle, Buga the Cross Hand was the initiator of Lund's main mission, Courage. Brando was one of the few players who had personally experienced this series of missions. In fact, he still had a vivid memory of that shocking battle. He remembered, that should be the last part of the mission. In the mission, the players had to help Buga kill one of the 12 tree herders' patriarchs, the envoy of sorrow, Frunica. Frunica was level 97, and had mastered the highest level of the superior element darkness. He had almost perfected his bronze body. In fact, in the era when the player's level cap was only level 83, the 12 tree herders' patriarchs were basically undefeatable nightmares. At that time, the story went like this. Buga carried the great sword, the legendary Arwen, on his back, and led the players into the headquarters of the tree herders in the Lone Kingdom, the Forbidden Forest. Using the knight's swordsmanship of the Scene School, he was also the only legendary existence who had mastered level 17 swordsmanship. The player's level cap was 13. He only needed 4 strikes to kill the envoy of sorrow, Frunica. Throughout the entire mission, the players were like spectators. They only needed to help Buga block the monsters and stall for time. In fact, it was this battle that cemented Brando's decision to walk the path of a warrior to the end. He was only level 72 at that time, but later on, he became one of the few pure warriors in Wonde who had a silver body. Thinking back to that time and looking at Buga, who was still in his prime, Brando was a little dazed. He didn't expect to meet him here. This was the future greatsword hero Buga. Of course, Brando didn't dare to confirm that Buga didn't have the same terrifying strength as he did in the future. But from what he remembered, Buga the Crosshand was already a student of the knight's swordsmanship of the Scene School at the age of 17. Not long after that, he got to know the Duke of Lone. But why would he appear in such a remote place? Why is he here? Brando had just thought of this when he felt Buga's gaze on him. You're using military swordsmanship? Buga's blue-gray eyes flashed with a faint light. His eyebrows were sparse, and his eyes were dull and lifeless. But from his appearance, this future greatsword hero didn't look like a monster at all. But the aura he exuded told him one thing. This ordinary-looking man was definitely a terrifying beast. The more sensitive one's senses were, the more they could feel this. Brando stood there. His 3.7 ounces of perceptive sense was equivalent to a normal person being able to hear whispers behind a wall. He could also easily feel the flow of air. But at this moment, Byuga gave him the feeling that he was a towering mountain, standing still and unmoving. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. He clearly saw that the other party was standing there alone, but he felt as if he was facing an impenetrable wall. Brando gulped, slightly surprised. In the game, one would need to be at least level 30 to have such an aura. If that's the case, doesn't that mean Byuga has already awakened his elemental power? So young? He was shocked. Brando knew that Byuga wasn't a chosen one, but this achievement was enough to make some chosen ones blush with shame. As expected of a monster. Are you from the army? Or are you a young man from a garrison somewhere? There shouldn't be anyone with your strength in the militia. Byuga raised his eyebrows slightly and asked. Brando's reaction wasn't out of his expectations. So far, Eek was probably the only one in the entire mercenary group who could remain unmoved under his aura. That young man could indeed be said to be a prodigy. Byuga couldn't help but smile when he thought of Eek. But the smile disappeared as soon as it appeared, because Byuga was still staring at Brando. In the whole of Erewhon, there were only 3 types of people who practiced military swordsmanship: soldiers, militia, or garrison. Knight nobles mostly had their own family swordsmanship, while adventurers and mercenaries from all over the world, even if they were from the military, would add their own swordsmanship after being honed in battle. And this young man in front of him was obviously a student from the training camp. Byuga's identity was special, so he knew all these things very well. But he didn't expect Brando to shake his head. No, actually my ancestor was a Highland knight, but I'm here alone without my squire. As you can see, I want to join you temporarily because it's beneficial for both of us. I don't have any other motives, and if I have any other ideas, that's all. He thought for a while and decided not to directly point out Byuga's identity to avoid arousing suspicion. The man standing beside Byuga, wearing an explorer's hat, heard this answer and showed a kind smile. We're more than happy to accept your suggestion, but you should understand that a mercenary group doesn't need burdens. Brando glanced at Byuga and understood 80% of the situation. I understand, so please tell me who I want to spar with. I think I've already defeated someone, and according to the rules, there shouldn't be more than 3 such tests. As a player who spent most of his time traveling, Brando was as familiar with the rules as any scholar who studied them. Makarov and Byuga looked at each other. Then the tall man took out his greatsword and said, "Then let me test you, young man." As expected, Brando couldn't help but take a deep breath. He looked at Byuga's thin face, but he didn't feel nervous. Instead, he felt excited. All right, I wonder how strong Byuga is now. But it's not a bad idea to test my strength against this future great swordsman. Brando couldn't help but feel excited. He raised his great sword and felt every cell in his body burning. When he became a level 130 warrior, Byuga had already passed away. In fact, one of Brando's biggest regrets was that he didn't have the chance to spar with the great swordsman in his heart before he matured. Byuga was once his goal, and even though he awakened his silver body, he still missed the chance to spar with this great swordsman. However, he didn't expect that when time returned to this moment, he would accidentally win another chance like this. Although he couldn't be considered a swordsman with outstanding swordsmanship, Brando knew that his understanding of swordsmanship wasn't inferior to anyone else. It was as if he had returned to the level 130 veteran warrior that he once was. He looked up, and his eyes were so bright that they seemed to be burning. The young man raised his greatsword. The level 10 military swordsmanship was no longer as simple as a high-level basic swordsmanship, and the natural aura it exuded was enough to capture everyone's attention. Brendel had seen such an aura from his grandfather before, but it did not cause people to feel as if they were about to fall into the abyss and fall into the abyss. But it was enough to stun the mercenaries. Great military swordsmanship. Byuga's eyes glowed. You're qualified to spar with me. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 139. You do have what it takes to fight me. Just as the word fight came out of his mouth, Fujia's greatsword swung over his head like a silver chain. There was a distance of about 10 meters between him and Brando, but in a split second the heavy blade had already reached Brando's head. Brando did not need to look up to know how dangerous the attack was. It was as if 1,000 miles of mountains were collapsing on top of his head, and thunder was rolling down from the sky. Before the sword even reached him, the momentum was already overwhelming. This sword was at least at the peak of gold rank, but it was different from Terst's sword. Bugha's sword was thick and heavy, and the moment he struck out, it made people feel small and insignificant, as if they couldn't dodge it at all. Brendel had experienced such a sword before. Even though he did not experience it personally, but the mountain collapsing, tsunami-like momentum was the same as this time. He closed his eyes and raised the sword above his head. His forehead, shoulder, and left arm formed a solid line of defense. This was Erwin's most profound parrying technique. Erwin's military swordsmanship level 9. Brando hoped that this parrying technique, which had a 27% deflection rate in the game, would have the desired effect. He needed to be calm when facing Bugha's greatsword. The greatsword swung down, and the two swords clashed. Dazzling sparks flew as the two swords collided. Brando's long sword bent backwards as much as possible, but it was not at its limit yet. The young man continued to adjust his strength, but Bugha's greatsword was like a giant boulder. The unparalleled strength of the greatsword penetrated into his arms inch by inch. He quickly realized that he could not retreat and he could not dodge. There was no way out. Brando's thoughts flashed like lightning, and his understanding of the warrior class flashed through his mind. Or rather, it was more like an instinctive reaction. He leaned back and slid to the side. Bugha's greatsword missed its target and hit the ground with a loud crack. The 5 wooden planks crumbled at the same time, and the wood splinters scattered like butterflies. Brando suddenly realized that Bugha was not using his full strength. This future Grandmaster swordsman had exposed his trump card the moment he drew his sword. Bugha had already awakened his elemental element. His elemental element was earth, which was of a relatively high level. Otherwise, he would not have been able to comprehend such a vast and boundless sword will. Brando thought as he panted. The hall was completely silent. Although everything that had happened just now was like a fleeting shadow, and almost no one had seen clearly what had happened in the previous exchange. However, when they saw that Brando didn't seem to have suffered much of a loss, they couldn't help but hold back their exclamations. For a moment they didn't know what to say. Bugha's 70% attack was dodged by a swordsman, who was only an upper iron level swordsman. What was going on? Those mercenaries who thought they were as strong as Brando couldn't help but put themselves in his shoes and think about what they could do under that level of attack. It was as if he could only close his eyes and wait for death. That attack just now, it seems like the vice commander used at least 70% of his strength. It's luck, right? Such exquisite swordsmanship. How is that possible? Whispers spread among the crowd, and the spectators all had different expressions as they looked at each other. However, the two combatants ignored them. Bugha raised his head and did not rush to pull his greatsword out of the ground. Instead, he looked at Brando in surprise. At first, he thought that Brando was just a young man with some talent, but he was used to seeing Eek's prodigy and didn't think much of the others. But now, Bugha realized that the young man in front of him was not simple at all. That slip just now was obviously a profound technique. Bugha's guess was not wrong. Brando's technique came from the long-lost swordsmanship of the fallen elves, the movement technique of the shadow sword. This swordsmanship focused on dexterity and agility, and its purpose was to attack the enemy without defense. That was why Brando used it to deal with Bugha. Unfortunately, Brando did not dare to hope for that swordsmanship. According to his experience in the game, Wone should be in the first chapter of the game, The Empire of Birth, which talked about the rise of Madara. Unearthing the ancient texts would have to wait until the third chapter, Ancient Legacies, and those ancient swordsmanship would only appear in the light of day at that time. Seeing that Bugha stopped attacking, Brando sighed in relief. He swung his arm, but he did not feel any soreness or numbness. This meant that Bugha had maintained his strength at the same level as him. His heart suddenly skipped a beat. Since Bugha only treated this battle as a test, then he might have a chance to turn the tables. Brando was eager to give it a try. If Bugha maintained his strength at the same level as him and tried to defeat him with only his understanding of swordsmanship, then he would be digging his own grave. Who was he? Even though level 130 wasn't the strongest player in the Amber Sword, it wasn't something that the current Bugha could compare to. Brando's character in the game had used 17 different swordsmanship in the past 100 years, and more than half of them had reached level 10. As for the swordsmanship that he had seen and fought against, there were countless of them. Byuga's swordsmanship came from Sean's Night School of Swordsmanship, which was how he got his nickname Crosshand. Coupled with his own understanding of the earth swordsmanship, that kind of majestic strength combined with the momentum of 1,000 caddies, it was enough to capture the opponent's attention before the sword was even drawn. Unfortunately, this set of swordsmanship had no effect on Brando. He even knew that he would not fall into his opponent's rhythm, so before Byuga could draw his sword, he had already taken the initiative to attack. The move was simple Erwin's military style of swordsmanship. However, this stab gave everyone a fright, especially those who had already learned Erwin's military style of swordsmanship. Swordsmanship was just a beginner's technique, Erwin's military style of swordsmanship level 0. Many people had learned it and practiced it repeatedly, but they could not imagine how a sword could cross a distance of 5 meters in an instant. Brando saw a flash of surprise in Byuga's eyes, and he could not help but laugh in his heart. It seemed that although this future Grandmaster swordsmanship was an intermediate level swordsmanship, the level of his swordsmanship had not reached a certain level. After all, at this point in time, Byuga was at most 50 or 60 years old, which was the period of his growth. It was normal that his swordsmanship had not reached the level of a master yet. But if that was the case, then he would not understand how terrifying a master's swordsmanship could be once it surpassed level 10. Erwin's military style of swordsmanship had a range of 1.5 meters, and with the master's bonus it could reach 3.5 meters. However, Brando knew a few tricks, and 5 meters was the result of him deliberately hiding his strength. Otherwise, it would not be impossible for his sword to cross 7 meters. Of course, when his swordsmanship reached level 20, the bonus of a Grandmaster's swordsmanship would be monstrous. Above Grandmaster, there was the legendary threshold of level 30, but Brando had only heard of it, and had never seen it with his own eyes. In any case, his sword was as fast as a shooting star. It was so fast that the surrounding mercenaries forgot to boo. At this time, Byuga did not have time to withdraw his weapon. After a slight pause, he noticed Brando's intention and could not help but laugh. In his opinion, a swordsman should not rely on such petty tricks to fight against enemies. But since Brando insisted, he subconsciously prepared to teach this young man a lesson. Unfortunately, Byuga immediately realized that it was not the case. Brando's sword seemed to have come alive. It was obviously a simple thrust, but after withdrawing his sword, he should have taken another step and used the hilt to strike his opponent. Then he would turn around and strike again. Brando thought so too, but at the last moment, Byuga saw him change direction 3 times and directly thrust his sword towards his chest. Byuga was slightly startled. He had no choice but to withdraw his sword and move sideways. But Brando seemed to know what he was going to do. His sword was already waiting in front of him. This future Grandmaster swordsman was shocked and could only retreat again. But once he retreated, it was not over, because Brando followed up with another 3 swords and a sudden thrust. After another thrust, Byuga could no longer hold back. He was very familiar with Erwin's military swordsmanship, but he had never seen anyone use Erwin's military swordsmanship like this before. But Brando was able to use it methodically, and with such brilliance. Byuga swore that in this country, there was not a single infantry manual that described the techniques of this swordsmanship. But now this young man was telling him that it was possible. This was a technique that countless warriors had come up with. Its techniques had long surpassed Erwin's military swordsmanship, and most of the NPC instructors had recommended the basic attack routes and routines. In the past 30 to 40 years, players had begun to summarize the essence of battle tactics, and they finally realized that they did not need to blindly follow the system's instructions. The innovation of techniques had begun. And now, Byuga was facing the new Erwin's military swordsmanship that the players had laid the foundation for 30 years later. And in this, there was Brando's own experience as a Grandmaster swordsman. That was why when Byuga entered Brando's rhythm, he immediately felt the pressure. The young man in front of him seemed to know his every move, and he himself was at a loss. It felt like a novice swordsman facing off against a master swordsman. Byuga suddenly recalled what happened when he first started learning swordsmanship. It was not a difference in strength. It was a difference in technique. This future Grandmaster swordsman was forced back 7 or 8 steps by Brando, and he could not even touch the edge of his own sword. He could not take it anymore, and if this continued, there would be no result. In the end, he had no choice but to use his full strength. He directly used his elemental power to block Brando's attack. Dang! A loud sound rang out. This time, Brando was finally unable to defend himself, and he was sent flying back 10 meters into the crowd. The hall was silent. No one even remembered to cheer for this attack. The mercenaries only had a dull thought in their minds. What kind of swordsmanship was that? Was this what Erwin's military swordsmanship looked like? How high was this young man's talent in swordsmanship? Buga was almost unable to block a round of attacks? Could it be that I'm still asleep? No, this must be a dream. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 140. I didn't expect my lord's swordsmanship to be so high. Amandina praised without reservation as they walked. The only time she had the chance to witness Brando's full strength was at Bragg's underground auction, but she was busy running away with Roman and did not have the time to see how Brando dealt with the terracotta captain. The footsteps of the 3 people passed through the empty corridor inside the stone wall of the inn. A series of hollow sounds extended forward until the dark end of the corridor. The owner of the inn had carved stone windows into the rock wall to provide light. Looking forward, the natural light cast pale, faint spots of light on the dark floor at regular intervals. Yeah, Brando has always been very strong, Roman added with a little self-satisfaction. She narrowed her eyes with a hint of natural charm. She turned around and glanced at Brando with a smile. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he was worried that she was planning something strange again. This worry was not groundless. Before leaving the forest city, Roman did not know her place at all. First, she pretended to be a merchant to visit the local nobles and investigate the market. Then she secretly bought a map from the Brotherhood of Thieves from Magetan to Chablis. This could be said to be extremely daring, since privately drawing a map in this era was a risk of being hanged. Of course, this matter was carried out without Brendel's knowledge. If it wasn't for the fact that she could never hide anything from him, he probably wouldn't have known that she was secretly doing these little things by herself. Hiding a map, pretending to be a noble, and forging documents in documents. Brando thought that he had already disregarded the laws of this ancient kingdom, but he did not expect that Romain did not even care about the black cover of the kingdom's laws. Of course, Brando suspected that she did not even know about the existence of the law. But Roman was careful and cautious outside, and she was as smart as a little fox. She did not reveal anything at all. If Brando did not find her secretly counting money in the carriage, he would not have known that she had used these illegal methods to earn a small sum of pocket money. Of course, Brando had already warned her about this matter, but she accepted it humbly and agreed with a few words. Perhaps only Martha would know how much she listened. What are you thinking about now? Brando could not help but ask. No. Roman hurriedly shook his head as if something was wrong. Then why are you so nervous? Brando's suspicions deepened, and he asked in a bad mood. Are you nervous, Brando? Roman touched her small face and asked curiously with her eyes wide open. Don't try to change the topic. This trick of yours is useless against me, little Roman. Don't call me that. Romain's eyebrows raised, but her eyes immediately. Brando, can I go out by myself? Of course not. Brando flatly refused. He was not afraid that this beautiful little town of Chablis would be ruined by her, but he had other considerations. Today he fought against Buga in front of everyone, and used his master-level swordsmanship to intimidate everyone. Even the maned wolf Makarov could not say anything about it, but that was only on the surface. After the hot-bloodedness of a warrior faded away, he felt that his thoughts had become clear again. In the past, it was normal for a single mercenary or adventurer to join an unfamiliar mercenary group during a trip. In fact, anyone could run into trouble during a trip and have to rely on others for help. Although the 314th clause of the mercenary contract rarely appeared in official contracts, it was not uncommon for a single person to join an unfamiliar group. Even though they were in a group on the surface, they were still working for their own interests. That was why, other than helping each other, there was not much meaning to it. Therefore, the written rules that stated that mercenary groups could propose tests for their members were actually just empty words in many cases. That was why Makarov the maned wolf and Buga's actions in the afternoon seemed to have a hidden meaning. Brando could even see the suspicion in the eyes of the middle-aged man standing beside Buga. But was there a need for that? He was a little doubtful. Then he couldn't help but think of the scene outside in the afternoon. From the words and actions of the young man named Eek, it seemed that the mercenary group's operation to suppress the bandits this time wasn't as simple as he had imagined. Do they have other motives? Or did they run into some trouble? That's what I want to know. He did not want these mercenaries to be after the same thing as him. That would be troublesome. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but frown deeply. What's wrong, Brando? The Roman blinked. Are you mad at me? Of course not. Brando glared at her. He knew that she was not afraid of him being angry. She was just trying to find a topic to talk about. Amandina, what did they say they were from? Brendel turned around and asked. He suddenly remembered something. This was a new question for him. The Grey Wolves mercenaries. Grey Wolves. Why is there a problem? Amandina asked. Nothing. Brando answered casually, and then muttered to himself. Grey Wolves mercenaries, Grey Wolves? Shouldn't it be the Blue Mountain mercenaries? That should be Makarov the maned wolf. That's right, the middle-aged man was exactly the same as the description. There should be no mistake. But why was the name of the mercenary group different? Could it be that there was a change in history? He raised an eyebrow. There was another possibility that the mercenary group had changed its name. But in this field, changing a name was not a small matter. Not to mention the fact that it had to be registered with the Adventurers Guild under the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It was a tedious and huge project. Under normal circumstances, it would not be successful unless there was a huge change. Huge change? Brendel raised his head and looked at the ray of natural light that shone through the stone window in front of him. His dark brown eyes flickered with uncertainty. How is it? The red-haired middle-aged man touched the scar on his face and turned around to ask. Standing at a high place, the cool breeze caressed his face. He could not help but squint his eyes and stare at the town of Chablis. The town was like a man-made hill, with a winding staircase going up the hill. The name maned Wolf Makarov had been famous in the mercenary world for 6 or 7 years, and it was left behind when he first joined the mercenary world. It meant that he was brave and fierce, and he fought without any regard for his life. He was like a ferocious alpha wolf, because in the southern mountains of Aween, the alpha wolf was also called a silver-maned wolf, hence the name. Ha! Buga put his hand on his forehead and smiled. That kid's military swordsmanship is superb, almost at the level of a master. Even in the army. He suddenly coughed. You know what I'm talking about. If we're talking about swordsmanship, I'm not as good as him. That young man called Brando is a true genius, born for the sword. It's hard for me to believe that someone of his age could have such a deep understanding of swordsmanship. Do you know, I can't even move freely in front of him, he smiled. Before I met young Master Eek, I never believed that there were geniuses in this world. A person can only reach that level through hard work and hard work. But after meeting young Master Eek, and especially after what happened today, I feel that I made a mistake. After saying that, he smiled, revealing his white teeth. You're comparing him to young Master Eek? Makarov turned around. The scar on his cheek was rumored to be from a battle with the Son of Night. But those who knew him well knew that he already had this scar before he became a mercenary. I don't think that young man has such skills. That's why you're the commander and I'm the swordsman. So, you have a very high opinion of him? Yes, but that young man reminded me of someone I know. Who? A stubborn fellow. Let's not talk about that. I don't think that young man is a spy from paper cards. Buga said. If they have such a talented backup, everyone would know about it. Makarov shook his head and smiled. It's hard to say. This is a sensitive time. I don't believe that paper cards is here just to snatch a mission from us. Chablis is just a small town without much profit. How can it be so attractive? You said that before, didn't you? You think they have other motives? Buga asked. That's right. What are they after? Those lizardmen bandits have other plans, or? I'm not sure, but Eek has been acting strangely for the past few days. Makarov closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I'm worried. I can't let a bunch of bastards follow us. The last mission was also because of them. This time I want to get rid of them once and for all. Buga looked at him. Grandmaster Eek agreed? Makarov nodded and shook his head. Grandmaster Eek didn't say anything. Then why don't we wait? We can't wait anymore. The tree herders are coming. Didn't you notice? Maned Wolf said against the wind. We'll leave in 3 days. What about that young man? Let him follow us. P.S. We're all civilized people, so please don't be rough with me. I'm already very pitiful equals. Chapter 141. Chablis July morning was a song composed with the chirping of the birds. When the first rays of the morning sun shone on the forest, the small town in the middle of the mountains was filled with vitality. The house that was decorated by the natives was filled with the scent of mint leaves. Brando woke up early in the morning. It seemed that after coming to this world, the habits of a swordsman overwhelmed the habits of a gaming otaku. Sleeping in seemed to be something that happened in the last century. Brando looked at the mountains of Chablis through the stone window at the side of the room. He pressed 2 of his fingers on the card and flipped it open with his thumb. The wind elemental crystal that was placed at the side immediately vaporized into green smoke and merged into the card. A small whirlwind blew in the small space, and a dimensional rift opened and closed, and 20 wind spirit spiders shot out from it. Brando immediately gave an order. These little creatures that came from the wind realm immediately turned into mist with a series of squeaking sounds, and quickly turned into a cloud of smoke that floated out of the room. Seeing this scene, Brendel smiled and opened a mana potion. It seems to be a storyline quest. He frowned as he thought. This thought had caused him to be unable to sleep well for the past 2 days. It revolved around a dungeon, and after a certain period of time, a storyline would be triggered. These storylines were all deduced by the system, so it did not seem strange on the surface. In fact, the real-time quest system was one of the selling points of the Amber Sword. But in this world, it seemed like the storyline of the game was reproduced in real life. I understand this point. Brando thought carefully and finally remembered something. It was something that was vaguely mentioned in a guide about the Balagon ruins a few years ago. It talked about the experience of the first party that entered the dungeon. Seemed vaguely familiar. But when he raised his head, his thoughts were interrupted. Knock, knock, knock. There was a knock on the door. It was definitely not a Roman person because this young lady did not know how to knock. She was not afraid of people saying that she did not have a good upbringing. It could not be Amandina either, because she was always polite and would not be in such a hurry. Brando had already guessed that it was Makarov's people outside in the blink of an eye. Please come in. The door opened, and behind it were 2 young men. One of them was the white-haired young man who looked as feminine as a woman in the afternoon the day before yesterday. He was looking at him with a sour face. The other one Brando had never seen before, but he guessed that he was about the same age as the former. He had short hair and looked a little skinny. He was looking at the room curiously. Mr. Brando, we are about to depart. You are? The short young man looked at him with curiosity, suspicion, and awe in his eyes. Obviously, Brando's battle yesterday afternoon had left a deep impression on the new members of the mercenary group. A young man in his 20s was able to fight to a draw with the deputy commander. This was what most of the young men thought. In the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Buga's strength was far above Makarov's, and that was a publicly acknowledged fact. In other words, this young man's strength was simply unimaginable at their age. He had also heard of the legends of the Chosen One, but no one knew how strong the Chosen One was. He couldn't help but look at Brando, wondering if he was one of the legendary Chosen One. However, Brando obviously didn't know what the young man was thinking. If he knew, he would have laughed out loud. In fact, with his current strength, he was still far from being a reverend, let alone a Chosen One. All right, thank you. He nodded at the young man without knowing anything. We will be there soon. But the white-haired young man immediately snorted. Brendel could not help but look at this guy. After yesterday's interaction, he already knew that this guy was a nobleman's son who went out to travel. It was no wonder he had such an arrogant temper. As for why he joined this mercenary group, it was probably another story. Anyway, he wasn't interested in knowing. But even if he didn't mind, it didn't mean that the other party didn't mind. The white-haired young man was clearly angered by being ignored. He couldn't help but snort and say, "Listen, although I'm not your opponent, I'll keep an eye on you at all times. Don't think you can play any tricks." The young man beside him was stunned. He obviously didn't expect his companion to say such words. He couldn't help but turn around and open his mouth, but he didn't say anything in the end. "Oh? You're called Rady?" Brendel scolded him in his mind, then raised his head and asked, "None of your business." The white-haired young man snorted. "Are all nobles so uneducated?" Brando asked. "You." The white-haired young man gritted his teeth and wanted to draw his sword, but when he thought of the difference in strength, he couldn't help but back down. "I heard Eek escaped? How did you know you?" Rady frowned and was about to question when he saw Brando's smile. He immediately realized his slip of the tongue and couldn't help but snort heavily. "You care too much, I'll tell the leader about this." Brando thought to himself, "Do you think everyone is an idiot like you?" But on the surface he still smiled and said, "I'm just asking. You know that I met Mr. Eek 2 days ago." Who knows? Rady thought. But even though he gritted his teeth in anger, he still deliberately maintained a cold expression. "I heard you and the Silver Sword St. Gorikes came from the same place?" Brando changed the topic. "And you?" The white-haired young man suddenly remembered Brando's previous ridicule and forcefully swallowed the words back into his stomach. In the end it turned into a cold snort. But he also realized that he couldn't get any advantage over Brando verbally, so he simply dragged his colleague away and left Brando alone. He thought to himself that it wasn't like this guy couldn't find his way, and it was better if he couldn't find his way. Brando couldn't help but laugh in his heart. That guy Gorikes actually had admirers. Back then, he learned the sword art called Heaven's Limit from Gorikes. It was a pity that Gorikes had 3 intermediate sword arts: Heaven's Sword, Thunder's Sword, and his self-created Heaven's Limit sword. But Brando himself didn't even get a single advanced sword art mission. Instead, he was choked by that old guy's temper. This guy definitely didn't know that Gorikes loved gambling. And his gambling character was extremely bad. Not only would he lose every bet, but he would also often not admit to it. But the sword art Heaven's Limit. Thinking until here, he couldn't help but smile. With the previous experience, this time would be easy. It was a pity that Gorikes should still be traveling around Cruz, or else he would be able to find him right now. Byuga and Makarov looked at each other in dismay. But in the end it was the mercenary leader called Maned Wolf, who couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Brando, these people are?" He pointed at the 12 mercenaries beside Brando. With Martha as the leader, the entire Chablis Lantern Grass Inn was under their strict surveillance. From the reports from the various hidden sentries, there were only ordinary guests staying in the inn since 3 days ago. However, these guys who were carrying a bunch of flying axes, javelins, large round shields, horned helmets, and sharp blades didn't look like ordinary guests at all, did they? Where did they come from? Brando obviously didn't understand Makarov's confusion. He shrugged and smiled. "They are my men. I remember I told you before that they are mercenaries that I hired." They came from a place far away. As a merchant, I have to travel from place to place. These mercenaries came from a minority in the east of the kingdom, so please don't mind their attire," he said with a smile as if it was true. But Amandina and Roman looked at him. Romain thought with a simple thought that ordinary people could not understand. So Brando had connections with a minority in the east of the kingdom. He is indeed powerful. But Amandina's thoughts were not as simple as Romain's. She had long suspected where Brando's men came from. Even though she knew that Brando had a mercenary group, they should be in Arek's territory right now, and they shouldn't be from a minority. The Shire as well. Even though Brando told them that the Shire had returned to Karsuk, she still felt that something was wrong. But she could only bury her suspicions in her heart. She could not use it to question her lord. Even Brando's aides had doubts, let alone Makarov and Byuga. These 2 historical figures were considered to have seen a lot of things, but they couldn't figure out what was going on. Because of Eek's escape, the sentries they set up were at least silver-ranked, but these iron-ranked mercenaries still managed to sneak in without anyone noticing. Makarov couldn't help but furrow his brows. His evaluation of Brando in his heart jumped 3 levels, and he became a little mysterious. "So, Commander Makarov, can we depart now?" Brando asked. "Of course." Makarov nodded with difficulty. He made up his mind to place Brando's group in the middle of the group and keep an eye on them to prevent anything from happening. He was originally full of confidence, but now he wasn't so confident anymore. A young man with outstanding swordsmanship who was close to silver-ranked, and 12 mercenaries who were at least silver-ranked, gave him a headache just thinking about it. He couldn't help but turn to Buga and grumble. "Old friend, this is the result of your investigation?" He couldn't help but ask. Buga shrugged. Makarov asked him to investigate the mercenaries that Brando mentioned, but he didn't find any clues after 2 days. He didn't expect these 12 people to appear out of nowhere. Even though they were only silver-ranked, he didn't believe it himself. He looked at the strange mercenaries and thought that they must have used some method to hide their strength. What is this? Are they living people? The future Grandmaster Swordsman couldn't help but roll his eyes. P.S. The reason why the update is slower than usual is because I have a cold equals and equals. On the last day of February, please vote next month. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 142. In the era of cold weapons, a war was often not as optimistic as people imagined. Before coming into contact with such a face-to-face battle, it was difficult for people living in a peaceful era to speculate about the pairs of eyes that roamed the battlefield, choosing people to devour. The battle was a touch of bone-chilling cold, how the cold, sharp, snow-white blade pierced the throat, causing blood to splatter and blend into the night. The dying man struggled with all his might, staring at the last scene he could see with a sad and powerless gaze. It should be a scene that gradually dimmed and stilled. Then, because the blood foam choked back into the lungs, the wounded coughed hoarsely and curled up miserably as they died. But there were still many people who took the scene in the novel for granted and replaced it with a real battle, just like the first batch of players in the Amber Sword, and those who came after. Of course, at that time, Brando also had an identity called Sophie. He remembered that his first real battle in the game in the past unfolded comically and laughably. There was no battle formation as imagined, and the 2 armies faced off. It was in a similar forest, Deltarsen Forest. Brando still remembered that place. The dense jungle stretched along the steep and rugged coastline, and the opponent was hidden between the cliffs, playing hide-and-seek with the slave traders and their private army through the caves that extended in all directions. Because the real confrontation actually took place between the elite scouts, the large army of players drew a beautiful scattered line in the jungle in an orderly manner, and their number was about 3 times that of the slave private army, or even a little more. But in a real confrontation, the balance of victory and defeat did not necessarily depend on the number of players. The beginning of the battle was accompanied by a one-sided chaos among the players, which was natural. The members and the organizers could not find each other, and most people could only form small teams and fight on their own. For several hours, the players' flanks were attacked, and the thousands of people in the middle were only delayed by a small group of cavalry. Yes, most people understood that the flanks were under attack. But the problem was, where were the scouts? Where were the flanks? When you put yourself in the shoes of a huge battlefield with a width of several kilometers, you would find that being able to overlook the entire battlefield from a 45-degree angle was not only a happy thing, but also an extravagant wish that you could only wish for but not ask for. Brando clearly remembered that he was in a forest surrounded by his own people. There were flags of the Union, the Personal, the Knight, the Squire, the Swallowtail flag, the Square flag, but no one knew what they meant. Most people, including him, could only follow the crowd and move forward blindly for a few hours. Occasionally, they would encounter a small group of private slave soldiers. Everyone would swarm them like a hot knife through butter. At first, the players were in high spirits, thinking that victory was in sight. But in the end, if one were to look down at the battlefield, they would find that this huge army had already been torn apart. 2 to 3 teams of professional mercenaries were in the middle of this fragmented cake, gnawing away at its insides like maggots. By the time the sky darkened, the enemy's banners could be seen everywhere. Recalling that war, it was later nicknamed the Massacre of Dirtle. In fact, this name vividly described the situation of more than 1,700 players from the 3 guilds who had gathered together. There was no doubt that these players were brave warriors. Even in the end, they formed their own small teams and fought to the death. Of course, the result was complete annihilation. In fact, the real irony was that in the entire morning and afternoon, the damage done by the players was not as great as the damage done by the slave traders in the night. Brando thought back to that battle. Not only did he feel awkward, but he also felt cold sweat on his forehead. After that, until the Bucci War, during the Second War of the Black Rose, the players gradually learned how to set up the battlefield and what flags they needed, how to distinguish which knight's army belonged to which flag from the strange emblems. The players also learned to set up the battlefield on a flat slope under a high ground, so that their commanders could see the entire battlefield in a 10-kilometer radius. Just like the maned wolf Makarov was doing now. Of course, the battle between mercenaries and bandits was far from a war. But the battle in the forest was similar. Brando tightened the reins to prevent the thick bushes from prickling the horses. He looked back and saw a few figures wearing green cloaks and holding a pomelo lacquer longbow. If it was a normal person, they would not have noticed them. Of course, they were not lizard men. Brando thought that the lizard men in the Balagon forest should be a branch of the jungle lizard men. Although their skin was covered in fine scales and was dark green, these short creatures were not as tall and burly as the Highlanders. There was no doubt that they were the best hunters among the Highlanders, the forest archers. This was the name given to them by the Cruz people when they invaded the forest. 200 years ago, this name was like a ghost in the forest to the Empire's soldiers, but to the Highlanders it was a title of honor. It meant that they were the swiftest hunters, the most accurate archers, and the best rangers. I wonder where Makarov found these rangers. Brendel's fingers tapped on the metal ornaments on the reins as he thought to himself. He had heard of these best rangers of mankind before. In fact, in the past or perhaps in the future, he had fought side by side with these rangers for a period of time. Perhaps it was not a long time, but it was enough to leave a deep impression on him. Could it be that they have been roaming around this area for a long time? With an excellent ranger, the work of the mercenary group would be much easier. It was obvious that the maned wolf Makarov had a way of dealing with his opponents. In fact, Brando knew that in times of chaos, the mercenaries were more familiar with their opponents than the latter were with them. The members of the Grey Wolves mercenary group were like that. It was not their first or second time doing this kind of work. Hiring mercenaries to fight against bandits in the wilderness was a common thing. And the more famous a mercenary was, the more experience he had. And the maned wolf Makarov was definitely not a nobody. In Brando's opinion, if a player wanted to deal with a bandit group, the best way to deal with them was to uproot their nest once and for all. He looked at Makarov's arrangement and understood that his plan was not far from his own. However, they had another advantage. They had already confirmed the location of the Lizardmen tribe. It would take a lot of effort for outsiders to find the ruins of the Balagon Silver Elves, but it was a piece of cake for the Highlanders and the Highlanders. Brando was a little hesitant at first. He wasn't sure if he had to join them in this adventure. After all, he could hire someone to follow them and wait for them. But that was a little risky. Following behind a mercenary group could be seen as a serious provocation, and it might cause unnecessary misunderstandings. The young man didn't want to create unnecessary trouble, so he thought of using the mercenary contract. But now, it seemed like he didn't expect Makarov to have so many forest rangers. It was a pleasant surprise. Of course, it also reminded him that he didn't follow Plana, or a normal guide wouldn't have been discovered by the forest rangers. He couldn't help but look at Makarov and Buga. The maned wolf Makarov and Buga's faces were tense. They had no choice but to let Brendel see their forest-piercing archers, and it was just a deterrent. Brando's group of 15 was like a ticking time bomb in the middle of the group, but he couldn't put them in the front or the back because it was more dangerous. Of course, if he had a choice, he would definitely throw Brando out. In fact, Buga had given him this signal more than once, but in the end he shook his head. He touched the scar on his face. The Grey Wolves mercenary group could not do anything that would betray the group's honor. Although many mercenary groups did this, including some famous large mercenary groups, their past was not that glorious. But he and Buga knew that their group was the same. The two men looked at each other and thought of Eek at the same time. Eek is still in town? Makarov asked. Buga nodded. Forget it, let him be. It's not his fault. The red-haired man shook his head and smiled bitterly. It's a pity that we can't tell him too much. He's doing it for your own good. He saw through paper cards, but he didn't know that we already knew. Drake was scheming against us, but that idiot didn't know that we were scheming against him. Makarov tilted his head in disdain. But the real problem isn't him but the young man in the group. I'm sure he's not with paper cards, but that doesn't make me less worried. That's ironic, don't you understand? The maned wolf mocked himself. Buga felt the same way. But Brando didn't understand how much trouble his arrival had caused for these two future leaders. There were about 70 of them heading straight for the ruins of the Silver Elves. It would be best if they could ambush them, but if they couldn't, they would have to work for a few days. Eliminating bandits in the forest wasn't something that could be done in one go. However, as he rode on the horse, he was thinking about another matter. He thought about the strategy post on the forum, but he couldn't figure out when Makarov the maned wolf got involved with a mercenary group called Grey Wolves. Shouldn't it be Blue Mountain? It was a light purple flower that bloomed in the mountains of the south. What was the purpose of using that flower as the emblem of the mercenary group? He suddenly shook his head to get rid of this irrelevant thought, and a flash of light cut through the dark sky and sea. It was as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over him, and he suddenly remembered the connection between the name and the phrase. The Grey Wolves Mercenaries. Right, the Grey Wolves Mercenaries. Brando raised his head and felt that the forest around him was dyed with a strange color. It was just a simple bandit clearing mission, but now it seemed that something was wrong. Logically speaking, the Grey Wolves Mercenaries had about 70 members. More than half of them were iron ranked, and a fifth of them were silver ranked. There was also the forest snipers. Why would a group like that need a strategy to clear out 100 level 20 lizardmen bandits? But there must be something wrong with it. Brando had just taken a deep breath when he heard Amandina's question from behind. Why did you arrange for them to be there? This isn't normal. He didn't need to turn around to imagine Amandina's frown. What do you know, little girl? It was Rady's voice. Brendel's face immediately contorted into a scowl. If everyone is used to last month's stable update, I will be giving everyone a surprise this month. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 143. He turned around and saw the white-haired youth's frosty face. The next thing that entered his field of vision was a dozen of Judland's heavy infantry behind the forest. The Judland people were one of the most common mercenaries in Aween. It was as if the residents of the Abyssal Sea region were professional soldiers. In fact, this tradition had its origins. The 11 port cities in the Judran region were at odds with each other, and the frequent wars gave birth to the profession of mercenaries. A typical Judran mercenary would at least wear a fine and heavy scale armor, carry a flaming steel spear on their back, and a shield half the height of a person on top of the spear. A long sword and an axe hung at their waist. Those were the tools they used to make a living, and every Judran person inherited that wealth from their parents. Brando did not even need to remember the background of the game, as he was already familiar with it. What's going on? He pulled on the reins to slow down his horse as he asked. Those are heavy infantry. Sir. Amandina's beautiful black gem-like eyes hid a trace of vigilance. She turned around and answered. They placed the heavy infantry at the back. It's obvious they don't trust us. Brendel glanced at the back and suddenly had a hint of understanding. He smiled. It's normal for them not to trust us. But Amandina's question caused the white-haired youth to snort in dissatisfaction. Brando glanced at him and asked, Then why did you place the Judran mercenaries at the back? It has nothing to do with you. Rady replied curtly. Sir, it's like this. They are moving too slowly in the forest. The skinny youth tugged at his sleeve and answered. Mr. Makarov placed them here to prevent any unexpected situations. It's not that he doesn't trust you. I see. Two birds with one stone. Compared to you, your companions aren't very good with words. Brendel's expression was one of understanding, but he did not forget to tease her. Rady's expression immediately darkened and he left without a word, leaving the skinny youth behind with a bitter smile. Brando looked at the youth and asked, What's your name? My name is Sanford. Sanford doesn't sound like a local name. Because I was originally Bragg's baker apprentice. Of course, that was before I became a mercenary. The young man looked at them and asked, Sir, from your accent, it seems that you are also from there. I'm not, but they are. Brando gestured with his chin towards Amandina and the Roman lady. Sanford smiled shyly as he looked at the girl riding beside Brando. But Amandina turned her head to the side and did not look at him. She was still a noble after all. Even though she was down and out, the arrogance of the Erewhon nobles still flowed in her veins. She did not want to interact with a commoner. However, the Roman didn't have this concern. The merchant girl winked at the young man. She was from Wuxia and could be considered as a fellow villager. That's right, it's explainable. But bringing heavy infantry to battle in the forest is not a good idea. Amandina tilted her head and looked at the Judlon mercenaries at the edge of the forest. But as soon as she said that, she was immediately met with a rebuttal. My lady, my lord, you can't say that. We have to eat in this world. Mr. Makarov is kind enough to take us in, and we have to be loyal to him. Look, I've never heard of a mercenary leaving his comrades in danger and running away alone. A sudden voice came from the forest. A bearded Judlon mercenary walked out from the back of the forest with a black weapon on his shoulder. He had a smile on his face as he shook his head and sighed with a heavy abyssal sea accent. Brando, Amandina, and the Roman turned around to look at the man. The young man narrowed his eyes. A person who could move freely in the forest would definitely have a high status in the mercenary group. Frank, assault captain. The Judlon mercenary rubbed his nose and introduced himself. What's that? Brando's gaze fell on the weapon in his hand. Flintlock gun, this is my treasure. Frank patted the pitch-black thing and laughed mischievously. Brando knew about this weapon. It used discarded magic crystals as a primer, and active elemental probes to ignite the gunpowder. It was a weapon that belonged to this world. The Offran people began to equip themselves with flintlock muskets as early as 30 years ago, and also established 2 flintlock regiments. The dwarves were even earlier, and their use of matchlock muskets could be traced back to the Silver Year. Firearms were extremely powerful in close range. The best quality flintlock gun could deal damage within 50 steps, and it was almost as powerful as a brass-ranked weapon of the same grade. The tactic of using firearms was very mature in this era, but it did not have a decisive advantage when compared to the enchanted projectile troops. However, he knew that there were many mercenaries who liked to use firearms, especially handguns. There were only a few who used rifles. After all, there were no bayonets in this era. Brando glanced at the mercenary. In this world of magic, firearms did not change the way of warfare as much as in his previous world. Gunpowder weapons were not common, so he did not have the time to study how bayonets worked. Amandina's face was a little hot. Vulgar mercenary, she thought, but her face was still vigilant. What did you mean by that? What I meant was that the fighting style you mentioned is a concern that only a regular army would have. We are mercenaries who are struggling, so we naturally have our own way of doing things. No matter if we are heavy infantry or light swordsmen, no matter what the situation is, everyone has to fight side by side. What you said is not wrong, but you still have to consider reality. Frank replied respectfully. Even though he was respectful on the surface, it was not difficult to hear the disdain in his words. Amandina choked for a moment. She knew that her knowledge was shallow because it was obtained from books, but she was still a little angry that her knowledge was taken for granted. She looked at Brando for a moment, then turned back. Her bright eyes were still vigilant, but she changed her tone and asked softly, "Do you believe what they said, Mr. Brando?" Brando looked at Frank and nodded. But what?" he asked back. "Do you really believe?" Amandina looked at him and asked with her eyes. Brando smiled and greeted Frank and Sanford, then urged his horse to speed up. He did not answer and only left the back view of the noble's daughter. But Amandina was a person who did not want to admit defeat. She also urged her horse to chase after him. She coughed and asked, "My lord, I feel that they are not normal." "Why?" "Intuition." "Little Roman, what do you think?" Brando asked without turning his head. "I don't know," Roman shook his head. "But my aunt said that if the explanation is too general or too detailed, it is a sign of guilt." Brando smiled and turned back to scratch her nose. But you still want to beat around the bush. What a sly little fox. I really don't know. Roman raised his eyebrows and hurriedly explained. Amandina didn't know what to do next to the flirting couple, but she finally understood what was going on. It was not that Brando did not know, but that he knew too well. It seemed that he had long suspected their motives, saying that the heavy infantrymen were slow, so they were placed at the back of the line sounded like an excuse. She sighed in relief when she thought of this. If that's the case, Amandina looked at Roman and Brando and asked with a red face, "What should we do?" "Just act according to the situation," Brando replied. He had already remembered the plot mentioned in the guide, but he thought that as long as these people were not targeting him, everything would be fine. But this matter was a little troublesome, and he could not help but have a headache. He originally wanted to reduce the trouble, but he did not think that he would be dragged into a new problem. If he had to blame someone, he could only blame Buga and Makarov for provoking such a troublesome opponent. Instead of saying that it was a competition between two mercenary groups, it was more accurate to say that the mastermind behind the Paper Cards mercenary group had his eyes on the Grey Wolves mercenaries. He could not help but look at the people around him. He was not worried about their fates, but he was thinking about how to get out of this trouble. But then again, it was a little strange that a small mercenary group would attract the attention of these people. Hey, tree herders! Compared to the tree herders, the members of All for One were like law-abiding citizens. But what was the purpose of the tree herders after the Grey Wolves mercenaries? Although he did not want to cause trouble, Brando subconsciously used the player's way of thinking to think about this matter. The guide gave the mission flow, but the details were very vague. Not to mention the background, which was not mentioned at all in the guide. He knocked on his head and thought of a way to get out of this situation before the Grey Wolves mercenaries and the tree herders fight. The boss of this quest was the Oracle Ekman. The root of the word Ekman came from the word in the rune language. It was a symbol of the vast mountains and the boundless ocean. In ancient times there was also a giant beast called Ekman, but whether it existed in Kurlut's mythology or in the legends of the mountain people, it symbolized walking between the mountains and forests. It was a huge, living, active mountain ridge. The giant beast Ekman was the descendant of the mountain giant Garl. Legend said that as long as it was connected to the earth, it would have endless life. The Oracle Ekman, to Brando, was more like the name of a monster with a symbolic meaning. According to the legends, the oracles were monsters that the tree shepherds used the blood of God to cultivate in the bodies of animals and humans. Although they had such a sacred name, they were the same as the golden demonic tree, a product that distorted nature and blasphemed against God. Brando couldn't help but recall his experience with the Oracle of Heaven, Amar, and the Oracle of Darkness, Black Lotus. The former was about level 50 in its incomplete form, and he fought it with his teammates in an underground dungeon in the Freeport of Ampere Seal. After a tough battle, they finally won. The latter was the true Oracle of Heaven, a level 67 elite leader, and the final boss of the perfect heroic main story quest in Deldra. They had to form two groups to defeat it. The Oracle of Heaven was so terrifying, and even though it was only level 50, it had the strength of a gold-ranked player. Brando didn't even have the slightest intention of fighting it, but he still wanted to take advantage of it. He looked at Buga and Makarov in front of him. In history, the Grey Wolves mercenaries should have been annihilated in this battle, but Makarov and Buga didn't die, which meant that there was a problem. As for what the problem was, it was up to him to decide. In any case, Brando's mind started to work. One must know that the Oracle of Heaven's loot list had the Heaven's Spear, Fana. It was one of the highest level fantasy weapons around level 50, and it was famous for its ability to ignore all physical defense. In the Dark Oracle's drop list, there was also the Dark Side of the Moon that countless Nephilic Judge players went crazy over. The Dark Side of the Moon was a mythical weapon. Legend had it that this scythe was once used by the god of death, Descartes. Decapitation, 1% chance of ignoring all defense and dealing 50% of the current HP of non-boss units. Annihilation, 10% chance of dealing damage to a weapon with this attribute to suppress all healing effects. In conclusion, even though the Oracle of Heaven was powerful, it also had another name, Treasure Vault. The tree herders were really rich, and only Lady Martha knew how they got so many rare equipment. Of course, this was not the most ridiculous thing. The blood of the gods of heaven came from the god of the clouds, Jamas. The blood of the gods of darkness came from the goddess of the abyss, Elaine. The blood of the gods of earth came from the lord of the mountains, the giant Garwitch. Martha above, how did they get the blood of the gods that have long since disappeared? Brando shook his head and muttered to himself. After the age of darkness, the gods in the sky had long since passed away and became stars. This was the era of mortals. Other than the one and only God of gods, Martha, this world was no longer ruled by powerful willpower. Those who were called gods today were either fake gods, or the many stars in the sky that were called laws. What are you thinking about, my lord? Amandina saw that he was absent-minded. Brando shook his head and blurted out, "The power of the mountains and rivers." The power of the mountains and rivers? Author's note. Yesterday the internet was cut off when I came back from dinner, and it's still not fixed yet. But even if the heavens want to destroy me, I will not give up. I will do my best to protect myself. There's also a 4,000-word chapter below. At the end I will continue to ask for votes. Looking at the votes now is really sad equals. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 144. The power of the mountains was a pair of gauntlets. In fact, the gauntlet was a special weapon in the amber sword. Although it was used by warriors, mercenaries, monks, and monk soldiers, compared to the latter two, it was less common among warriors and mercenaries. However, this did not stop Brando from being interested in the power of the mountains. When it came to the Oracle Ekman, the first thing that came to the mind of the players would be the power of the mountains, which was the most valuable item on the list, or the Thunderslayer, which was a complete drop. Of course, Brando would not dream about the Thunderslayer. As a level 67 Oracle, it should have the corresponding elemental power. Destroying a group of people like them would only be a matter of moving its fingers. Although the future Grand Sword hero Buga had also activated his elemental power, there was a natural difference between humans and sacred blood creatures. Unless the body was perfected in the later stage and obtained the golden bloodline, the difference between humans and sacred blood creatures was several levels. Otherwise, humans would be at a disadvantage as a lower race. However, not to mention the level 62 Thunderslayer, even the power of the mountains was enough to tempt people. As a level 45 fantasy weapon, Brando did not know how powerful the gauntlets were. In fact, he had only seen it once in a video. However, he knew one thing for sure. In terms of damage amplification, a level 45 fantasy weapon was 17 to 18 times more powerful than the Thorn of Light, or even more. Just this point alone was enough to make any player go crazy. In the past, Brendel had seen players who got mythical or fantasy weapons that were not suitable for their class and had to retrain their accounts. After all, players could choose their own class, but not everyone could get their hands on a weapon that was fantasy grade or above. This was a matter of luck. Of course, he could not do that now, but he was more than willing to redesign his leveling plan for a god weapon. After all, it was something that would bring him huge profits. Take the Lionheart sword for example. The kings of Aween had been searching for it for almost 7 centuries, but there was still no news of it. The Lionheart sword was merely a fantasy weapon. A level 70 fantasy longsword. Even though he had a clue about the Lionheart's whereabouts, Brendel knew that having a clue and completing a quest were two completely different things. It was too vague and unrealistic. If he could get the power of the mountains first, then his class design would definitely be based on the first fantasy weapon. He then patted his head to remind himself that both the Lionheart sword and the power of the mountains were just a fantasy. The Grey Wolves mercenary group had not encountered the tree herders yet, and their representative, the Paper Cards mercenary group, were nowhere to be seen. In fact, it was just his wishful thinking that Buga and Makarov could kill the Oracle. All in all, safety was the first priority. Then, he would see if he could find an opportunity to make some money. That was the safest way. Once Brando entered the zone, he would naturally follow the rules of the game. At this moment, Madara, the Lizardmen, the Oracle, and the tree herders were not even worth mentioning. The Oracle was a terrifying opponent, but that was all there was to it. Brando himself had faced 3 out of the 12 tree herders and defeated 2 of them. Even though he was no longer level 130, his experience and knowledge were still at that height. The Oracle was not without flaws. The power of the mountains? Amandina's black gem-like eyes flashed with a trace of doubt. She asked in confusion, "What is the power of the mountains?" I just thought of a famous treasure in this area. Legend has it that it is in the ruins of the Silver Elves, but no one has ever seen it." Brando had to find a suitable excuse for his slip of the tongue. He could not say that the power of the mountains was actually a fantasy weapon with a golden label, and that there would be an oracle called Ekman who would bring it over. He did not want to leave an impression that he was mentally unstable in Amandina's mind. But even so, his words still aroused the dissatisfaction of this noble lady. Amandina looked at him with a hint of resentment and sighed. "My lord, now is not the time to think about this, right?" "Of course." Brando could only nod with a bitter smile. "I was just distracted for a moment." But he could only fool himself. Amandina was smart and sharp, and she looked at him suspiciously. In her impression, the young knight was a shrewd and cautious young knight who would not be distracted by unimportant matters. It was as though he was constantly plotting something, even though everything he did seemed to be unrelated on the surface, but in the end, it was proven that everything was arranged in advance. Amandina was doubtful of how a person could achieve such a feat. The plan was still a plan, but Brendel seemed to know that some things would eventually happen, and he waited calmly for the right moment to happen. This kind of person was either extremely confident or had foresight. He was able to see the future, and could see the direction of the development of a matter. Of course, she did not even think that a person could predict the future. Even the astrologers who belonged to the royal family could only predict the direction of major events through the strings and cards controlled by the twins of fate. No one could predict the future, no matter how big or small. In her opinion, the only ones who could do this were the gods, but even the gods had passed away in this era. She obviously did not think that Brendel was not from this world. A moment of distraction? Amandina frowned slightly, and she showed a slight dissatisfaction. "My lord, if there are some things that you are not willing to tell me, I will not ask." Brando felt that he was more wrong than Do-E. Even though he had some secrets that he could not tell outsiders, he had no choice. Martha above, how could he tell outsiders these things? Even if he did, no one would believe him, and he would only leave behind the name of a lunatic. He wasn't going to do such a bad deal. He could only patiently explain, "It's not like that, Miss Amandina." But before he could finish, the Roman lady came back from who knows where and promised him with an excited expression, "If it's Brando's secret, I won't ask." The Roman promises. Brando glared at her fiercely. If there was a person in this world who was the best at showing off a desire to see the world in chaos, it would be this merchant lady. But in the end, he sighed and waved his hand. "Forget it, let's talk about business. Set up your tents a little closer to me at night. Don't take off your outer leather armor, and don't sleep too deeply, understand?" Amandina immediately looked around cautiously. "What's wrong? We'll talk about it when the time comes." He turned his head and saw the merchant lady nodding her head, but her expression clearly said, "I don't care at all." Brendel's eyes immediately narrowed. He knew her temperament very well. "Especially you, my dear Miss Romaine. You better stay awake. Don't think I don't know that you're like a little pig when you're asleep. If Mother Marcia doesn't come personally, no one would be able to wake you up. But my aunt said that women will age quickly if they don't sleep early. You didn't even die when you didn't sleep for a few days in Bucci. But if I slept at that time, Madara would catch up to me. It's the same now." Brando replied in an annoyed tone. His hands were stained with the smell of spices. From the pungent aroma, Iko could distinguish the large and small fennel from the silver sand coast and the cinnamon from Grimoires. He had practiced his sense of smell in the toxicology class, and distinguishing spices was just one of the skills he had learned. But the rich fragrance in the air still stimulated his nostrils and made him want to sneeze. Ike wished that his heart had stopped beating, but it did not go as he wished. His heart was still thumping in his chest. He shut his mouth tightly, trying not to make a sound. Even if he desperately wanted to gasp for breath, his chest hurt, and his head was attacked by waves of dizziness. He could only endure and let the sweat on his forehead drip down. He looked down and saw the sweat dripping down and forming a dark spot on the white sack. "Who are you people? What are you doing here?" Ike could not see the person who spoke, but he could tell who it was from the familiar voice. It was the leader of the second squadron, Capo, and his comrades. "Don't come over," he thought. "Don't speak. Everyone turn around and leave. Those bastards, don't let them get suspicious." He stared at the shadows on the opposite wall, afraid that he would miss the slightest detail. Occasionally, he would close his eyes and pray to Mother Marcia, praying that Capo and the others would leave immediately. But he knew that was impossible. Unless a miracle happened. That was why he prayed for a miracle. He always knew that his adoptive father, Makarov, left some men in town to keep an eye on him. Rather than keeping an eye on him, it was more like taking care of him. Apart from Buga and his adoptive father, Capo was the one who took care of him the most in the mercenary group. He was also his first swordsmanship teacher. He also knew that the man known as Maned Wolf Makarov knew that he was hiding in town all this time. Even when he sneaked back to the inn, they should know about it as well. It was just a tacit understanding between them. They still treated him like a child, as if he was always someone who needed to be taken care of. But it was different this time. Those guys are definitely not from the Paper Cards mercenary group. What's the big deal about the Paper Cards mercenary group? Do you think Yak will be afraid of an old rival who has been opposing me all year round? Why didn't his adoptive father think of this? He couldn't help but rub his forehead, but halfway through he put down his hand. We can't let those bastards find out. But Capo and his men are still outside. They are not their match. Those bastards are demons who kill without batting an eyelid. Eek struggled. There were a few times when he wanted to jump out to warn Capo and shout for them to leave. Even though he knew that his actions would be of no use, the young man's feelings for Capo as both a teacher and a friend urged him to fulfill his duty. It was his duty, but he knew that he had a more important responsibility. He could not let those bastards succeed. Where is the young man you were chasing? Capo spoke again. Eek's heart skipped a beat. Hurry up and hand Eek over, we all saw it. This was another younger voice, sounding even more impatient. Chris, you impulsive bastard. Eek cursed in his heart. He couldn't help but tighten his grip on his sword. His whole body couldn't help but tremble. Then he heard that familiar laughter. It was bone-chilling, like ice needles piercing his back. So you are really with him? P.S. I suddenly remembered that I don't have a full attendance, but it's still awesome. Everyone, please support us. By the way, please slow down for those who are DTs. Don't release it after only 15 minutes. It's already a flop to begin with. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 145. There's an acquaintance here, Carl. A man in a black knight's training uniform looked at the bonfire in the dark forest under the undulating mountain range from afar. The Grey Wolves mercenaries seemed to be sleeping in a large cradle. It was quiet in the direction of the camp. Only the wind from the sea from the west infiltrated the night, causing the forest to respond with rustling sounds. It sounded like the waves. It also sounded like some kind of monster was screaming in the forest far away. A tall monster was dragging the bloody corpse of a female sentinel out of the forest with its huge bony claws. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize it. He had seen this huntress in the afternoon. However, she was now a lifeless corpse. The monster's empty chest made cracking sounds, and the orange flames in its eyes flickered. It was dissatisfied with the Black Knight's casual attitude. It's not your turn to teach me a lesson, little guy. The monster's voice was dry and squeaky. It reminded people of clockwork that had not been maintained for a long time. It straightened its body and threw the corpse down. The dead mercenary fell into a bush like a rag doll, and the crackling sound of twigs snapping could be heard 34 feet away. However, this place was too far away from the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp. It was difficult for such a small sound to travel that far, especially in the windy night. The knight in black frowned as he glanced at his companion. He saw a group of ghost-like translucent spiders that were green in color and emitted a faint glow. They screeched as they jumped down from the treetops. Thud. A soft sound was heard. Brando was startled. He looked at the card that had fallen out of his pocket and was lying flat on the ground. The card had turned gray. It was a wind spirit spider. It had already entered the graveyard. However, the first thing he felt was not heartache. Instead, he picked up the card and was stunned. He immediately raised his head and extinguished the oil lamp. The surroundings became dark. The farthest light outside the tent was 100 feet away. So fast. He was caught off guard. In the evening, the Grey Wolves mercenaries chose to set up camp in the Windy Valley. Brando suggested to Makarov the maned wolf that the two sides should keep a distance from each other to avoid suspicion. Although Buga and Makarov were a little surprised, they still agreed. Brando didn't trust them, and they didn't trust the young man's subordinates either. Thus, the two sides, each with their own ulterior motives, reached a consensus. However, Makarov didn't expect that Brando would use this as an excuse to escape. The young man crawled out of the tent, and his skin shivered a little from the cold air. Even though Chablis mountain area was extremely hot during the day, the temperature in the valley dropped drastically at night. If a traveler didn't prepare a tent or a sleeping bag, he would still be cold. He looked left and right, and a few figures could not escape his senses. Even though Brando did not go through professional training, his 3/7-ounce perception was equivalent to a person with a natural gift. He could hear the sound of a needle falling to the ground 100 meters away in the silent night. It seems like Makarov only suspects us and doesn't have any ill intentions towards us. After confirming that there was no one nearby, he carefully crawled out of the tent. At this moment, the young man was fully armed. He wore nail armor and carried all the necessary weapons and tools. He dragged a backpack with one hand, which contained the necessary water and food. He then approached a tent not far away and patted the cloth. After a few seconds, a curious voice came from within. "Brando! Roman, why are you here?" Brando was speechless. He confirmed that it was indeed Amandina's tent. "It's a surprise." Amandina laughed softly in the tent. She was a little pleased with herself. "Surprise my ass." Brando turned around in annoyance. He saw Amandina coming out of the Roman's tent with her hair tied up. She had an apologetic look on her face, but Brando knew that if the Roman had any ideas, she would not care about what others thought. He sighed and apologized to the noble lady. "I'll have to trouble you." Amandina was surprised. A faint smile appeared on her face. She looked at the tent behind Brando and said, "I can see that my lord really likes the Roman lady." She mouthed the words. Brando nodded. He allowed Amandina to do as she pleased. It was not only because he felt a sense of familiarity towards such a carefree girl, but it was also because of Brando's soul. On the other hand, the Roman lady was the first person he met in this world. He had a special feeling towards her. Moreover, this merchant lady was smart and carefree. Very few people would dislike her. Even though Brendel was only 19 years old in this life, the two souls in his body determined that he was no longer the shy youth he once was. He understood what he should pursue and what kind of responsibilities he had to bear. He opened a corner of the tent and saw Amandina looking at him with a charming smile. "Are you ready?" he asked. Both Roman and Amandina nodded in agreement. Brando raised his head. As if in response to his movement, more than 10 figures came out of the surrounding tents. They didn't need to talk to each other as they began to quietly put away their tents. Although these mercenaries were fully armed, with all kinds of metal weapons hanging from their belts, they didn't make a single sound when they moved. It was Amandina's first time seeing Brando summon from the cards, but her bright eyes quickly flashed with a trace of surprise. What a group of well-trained mercenaries! Where did he find these people? The mercenaries of Lopez were able to leave their illustrious name in the long river of history. Naturally, they were not just for show. The creatures summoned by the card of fate represented a collective concept. In other words, the 12 mercenaries were a group of heroic spirits that best reflected the strengths of the mercenaries of Lopez. Loyalty, honor, high morale, strict discipline, and they did not fear death and pain like real creatures. They were probably the best soldiers that had ever appeared in this world. Unfortunately, Brando felt that the number was still too little. Even so, it was enough to make Amandina speechless. She quickly touched her cheeks and looked at Brando. She suspected that she was dreaming. It was not that she had never encountered mercenaries before. Nobles would more or less interact with these people because of their own businesses. Of course, other than the ruffians and scum, most mercenaries were more or less related to the military. But that was it. The best mercenaries she had seen were none other than the Grey Wolf's mercenaries. The maned wolf Makarov's mercenaries were definitely not ordinary mercenaries, but compared to the 12 mercenaries in Brendel's hands, it was like the difference between clouds and mud. The inherent laziness of mercenaries could not be seen in these people. They seemed to have something that was rarely seen in mercenaries. Amandina furrowed her eyebrows. She could not determine what it was at that moment. But after a flash of inspiration, she remembered the difference. It was pride and honor. She took a deep breath. Very few mercenaries who relied on fighting for a living would maintain a sacred sense of honor for their profession. It was more similar to a knight's sense of honor. She could not help but look at Brando again. In her heart, she was certain that these people were not mercenaries, but retainers that this young man brought out from his family. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. A young noble leaving his family to carve out his own world. This was like the plot of a legend. When she first heard Brando say this, she felt a little yearning. After all, everyone had the spirit of romance and adventure in their hearts. Even Amandina, who had received the most orthodox education since she was a child, was no exception. Assisting a young knight who started from scratch to conquer the world was an irresistible temptation for a girl of her age who had received such a degree of education. But from the looks of it, this lord did not start from scratch. Amandina was pleasantly surprised, as if she had discovered a small secret. Of course, she did not feel depressed because of this. On the contrary, she felt relieved. She convinced herself that at least this meant that Brando was prepared. He was not a hot-blooded young knight who acted blindly and only wanted to imitate the ancients. However, Brando did not expect that his subordinate would have so many thoughts after seeing his card soldiers. Of course, if he knew what Amandina was thinking, he would definitely think of a way to do it a few more times. This way, he would be able to easily gather a large number of loyal retainers. But he did not have the mood to care about these things. He quickly realized that he had encountered a small problem. The 12 mercenaries of Lopez quickly tidied up the camp, but when they gathered together and prepared to wait for the next order, Brando suddenly noticed 2 figures walking over from the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp. He immediately frowned. He had clearly seen one of the 2 figures walking over. It was a white-haired youth called Rady. Brando immediately thought that the other party might have noticed the commotion here, but he quickly suppressed this suspicion because the 2 people were clearly not walking towards them. He calculated the path that the other party would take. It should be between their camp and the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp. He was slightly startled. These 2 fellows wanted to go outside the camp? Traitor? Brando immediately thought of a possibility. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 146. Rady and the person beside him were getting closer and closer, and the 2 slender figures were like ghosts in the forest. Everyone stopped and looked in that direction at the same time. Amandina lowered her head to estimate, and her expression changed. She immediately looked at Brando, her black gem-like eyes filled with anxiety. Their camp was in the middle of the forest, and the mercenaries of Lopez had already put away their tents. Even if the other party was just passing by, they would definitely notice something was amiss. Don't be impatient. Brendel stared in that direction and replied. Even though most of the people present did not understand what he meant by don't be impatient, they subconsciously quietened down. Brendel raised his hand, and the calm expression on his face calmed everyone down. It was a clear hint to the others that they should not act rashly. Amandina opened her mouth slightly. The mercenaries of Lopez were Brando's summoned creatures, and their first duty was to carry out the orders of a planeswalker. Even if there was a cliff in front of them, they would not hesitate to move forward, let alone such a small request. But in the eyes of the noblewoman, these veterans who looked like they had been through hundreds of battles and should have been proud of themselves, just because of a small action from Brendel. The degree to which they obeyed his orders to the extent that it was shocking. No one spoke. She subconsciously held her breath, not even daring to breathe loudly. The wind in the valley whistled above their heads. The wind came from the mountain pass in the south, and it was like an invisible hand passing through the branches, causing the leaves on the top layer of the canopy to rustle. The dancing branches caused the dim starlight to flicker, and the intertwining light fell on Rady's face, causing the white-haired youth to have a gloomy expression. The two of them were not as careful as Brando expected, and it could be said that they did not care about the crackling sound of the branches breaking. Brando suddenly remembered that Makarov did not tell too many people that their camp was in this direction. This meant that Rady did not know that the two of them were approaching Brando's group. Even the maned wolf doesn't want to cause trouble? Brando thought. There were less than 100 feet left. Brando believed that as long as that guy walked to the edge of the forest, he would definitely notice the abnormality here. As long as he insisted that it was because he didn't trust them, they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. Even though the two of them looked suspicious, Makarov would rather trust his own party members. He was equally nervous, but he didn't show it on his face. The young man looked to the side and saw that the mercenary named Nightsong was also looking at him questioningly. He was the leader of this group of mercenaries, and it was as if he was the leader of this group of mercenaries. He was experienced and wise. The old mercenary's intention was clear. Should we take the initiative and kill him? But get rid of him? Easier said than done. This was a very common choice for mercenaries. Brando struggled. Although this was not the first time he had killed someone, it was different this time. If it's Pine Fortress, there's no room for survival. I'm not so pedantic that I can ignore the threat to my life. But in the end, he still had a soul that came from a civilized society, and to kill without hesitation just because of a suspicion was instinctive. But how could he not understand that for someone in his position, being indecisive was a taboo? He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Should he follow the will of this world and completely cut off his ties with the past? Or should he stick to his bottom line? He was Brando, but he also had Sophie's mark in his soul. If he denied this point, it would be the same as denying everything in the past. Perhaps that reality was nothing more than an illusion. Otherwise, why would he be in this world right now? Or was it a butterfly dreaming of Zhuangzhou? Who could say for sure? However, the memories that belonged to that world were so deep. The joys and sorrows of the past at a certain point in time seemed to be engraved in the memories of yesterday. How could he deny it? If he cut off the memories of the past, then what was the point of all his hard work? If he lost his soul, would he still be called a person? Even if he was afraid that he would not be the same person. For a moment, a mess of thoughts filled his mind, but it was also like a sharp sword that cut through all the knots in an instant. He opened his eyes like the king of the Macedonians. His eyes were clear, and he had found his answer. My lord. Amandina saw through Brando's hesitation, and she could not help but be slightly startled. She originally thought that this kind of decision was natural for a young noble like Brando, and there was no need to consider at all. This was the rule of the game between nobles. When Brando heard the girl's question, he turned around and looked at her. She could not help but be stunned again. She did not think that Brando would show such a look, self-deprecating, relaxed, and a trace of regret. She did not know where this young knight's compassionate look came from, and when did Erwin, a cold-blooded noble, become like this? Perhaps it was the tears of a crocodile, but it did not seem to be necessary. Or could it be that the Highland Knight of Karsuk still followed the ancient teachings to this day? When Brando raised his hand, it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but when he put it down, it was incomparably easy. Get ready. But if possible, try to only stun him. I don't want to completely fall out with the maned wolf. He ordered in a barely audible voice. He did not know if he would be seen as an idiot for doing so, but if he did not do so, then he would definitely be an idiot. The mercenaries of Lopez nodded in unison. As creatures that were summoned, they had no right to judge or question their lord's decision. But there was a trace of regret in the Nightsong tiger's eyes. If he wanted to settle this once and for all, he had to be more decisive. On the other hand, Amandina let out a sigh of relief. The girl's eyelashes fluttered, and she could not help but look at Brando with a new gaze. For the first time, she realized that the young lord that she followed seemed to have some special traits that she did not know about. She did not know if this trait was good or bad, but it did not seem to fit in with this ancient world. She did not know why, but she did not feel a trace of unnaturalness. On the contrary, this was the first time in a long time that she felt at ease. 70 feet. Brando. At this time, the Roman nervously called out from the side. Brando was stunned, but he still whispered, "Don't make a sound." Romain thought for a moment and nodded. The mercenaries of Lopez were already in position, waiting for Reedy and the other person to reach the edge of the clearing before swarming forward. 12 experienced soldiers with the strength of an iron-ranked warrior. They were confident that they could stop the two of them before they could react. But Brando was still a little nervous. There might be strong enemies outside the forest, and he could not waste any time here. But what surprised him was that when Rady and the other person were about to walk out of the bushes, they slowly stopped. What did they discover? Brando's eyelids twitched, and he almost immediately ordered his mercenaries to charge forward, but he forcefully stopped himself from doing so. Attacking from this distance would mess up the entire plan. The distance was too far, and there was a small patch of bushes in between. He slowly calmed down. It seems that the white-haired boy did not discover the situation here. He turned around to take a look. The mercenaries of Lopez were as calm as ever. Other than the heartless Miss Romain, who was still looking around, Amandina was so scared that her face was pale white. It was as if her heart was about to stop pumping blood into her body. He turned back again, and was surprised to see that Rady had not only stopped, but also turned back to talk to his companion. They were at least 20 meters away from the edge of the forest, and the clearing was at least 50 meters away. Even with Brando's perception, he could only pick up one or two keywords. The white-haired young man's voice was not loud, and he would occasionally look at the camp's direction as if he was concerned about something. But soon, the conversation between the two of them became heated. In the end, it turned into an argument. Even though most of the people here could not hear what they were saying, they could tell from their hands that neither side was able to convince the other. Brando could not help but feel gloomy when he realized that the two of them were not here for him. "It's the middle of the night. Are the two of you here to argue? Can't you go somewhere else then?" It was a pity that Rady could not hear Brando's thoughts. On the contrary, their voices became louder and louder. Brando could barely make out the words "eek," "comme Chablis," and "necklace." He raised his eyebrows in surprise. That young man called Eek is still in Chablis? It seems like Rady knows about it, and there's no reason for Macaros to not know about it. But this mercenary group is really full of problems. But he still did not understand why the white-haired young man would come out in the middle of the night to discuss something that had nothing to do with the current storyline. He could not help but raise his head and look through the gaps between the leaves. The blood star was already in the middle of the sky. This star is the most punctual way for Erewhon to time the summer nights. It's almost midnight. P.S. I didn't send the message last night because I was disconnected again. It's normal for me to be disconnected these days. If you want to scold someone, scold Chengdu Telecom. Also, I don't need a thief to judge whether or not I have integrity. F***CK, you want me to prepare things for you when you steal? Do I owe you anything? Chapter 147. It's almost midnight. Brendel could not help but think of the strategy guide. It said that the enemies would make their first move at midnight after the Lizardmen bandits were eliminated. The enemies in the guide were obviously the tree shepherds, or the mercenary group paper cards that was standing in front of the stage. The sudden attack was very fierce, and it could be said that all of us were struck senseless. The attack started from the north, but anyone who tried to escape to the south would die at least once. That's because the main force of the tree herders was in the south. Well, at least this means that the advanced AI that torrential rain promised wasn't just a gimmick on paper. Our response was to try our best to save the Grey Wolves mercenary group from the fate of destruction. It's worth noting that the maned Wolf Makarov and the vice leader, Buga, are extremely strong. They're about 45V and 55V players. Ensuring their survival is the most important factor in helping you complete the quest. However, we did discuss another possible solution. It came from a small discovery in the east. I think torrential rain must have considered the players' endurance at this stage, so they designed a radiant altar in the east of this area. Our group discussed how to transport it, but it doesn't matter what method we use. There's no doubt that as long as you can save the Grey Wolves mercenary group from the fate of destruction, this might be the most important condition for the quest to reach a 100% completion rate. Brando rubbed his nose. Rather than calling it a guide, it was more like a lesson summary. Due to the unique nature of the quest, He couldn't complete it repeatedly. He used to view the whole story as if he was reading a novel. After all, it was exciting to watch a group of players go on an adventure. Brando especially liked using his imagination to fill in the gaps between the lines. It was as if he was there in the real world. Damn it! If you're writing a battle report, you should at least make the time, place, and characters clear. Brando couldn't help but curse the person who wrote the guide had a bad habit. Is there really no problem with words like "one day at midnight" appearing in a serious lesson summary post? In the past he didn't think so, but now he realized that this kind of perfunctory attitude was very harmful. Of course, at this time he couldn't drag that guy out from the other side of the internet to listen to him talk about real men, big boobs. Now, he could only rely on his own experience to make up for the lack of a strategy. The only thing left for him to do was to look up at the sky. Of course, there was also the hope that Reedy could finish his sentence a little faster. Of course, he wasn't aiming for a 100% completion rate. In the past, if he completed a mission perfectly in the game, there would be a so-called double reward. But in this real world, where was he supposed to find the damned system to receive the reward? Emofe silently prayed to the sky. "Lord Martha, please throw a pie down." This was obviously unrealistic. Brando's plan was very clear. Previously, he did not understand the direction of the entire plot. Now that he remembered it clearly, he naturally had to revise his plan. Now, he had to leave the Grey Wolves mercenaries before the tree herders attacked, and then rush to the Altar of Light to open another branch. Then, he would directly use this branch to flatten the Lizardmen bandits, get the Sage Slate, and leave. As for whether the Grey Wolves mercenaries lived or died, it didn't matter much to him. Every year in Wonde, there were hundreds of mercenary groups that were destroyed due to various conflicts. Moreover, he didn't think that he had the ability to subdue Maned Wolf Makarov or Buga. Makarov was a level 45 great swordsman, and Buga was a level 56 Knight of the Church who had activated his elemental energy. Of course, Buga himself might not admit this. But no matter what, Brando didn't dare to think about these two big names for the time being. What he was relying on now was to find more potential stocks like Amandina and Tamar. Since he could see the future, then investing in the long term was obviously the best way to do things with low risk and high returns. But even though his imagination was beautiful, reality was not what he wanted. Not to mention that there were no flaws in his plan, Brando definitely did not consider such an unexpected situation. While he was thinking about it, the Roman girl behind him couldn't hold it in anymore. "Brando!" She raised her beautiful eyebrows and used her finger to poke Brando's back. She once again used a voice that she thought was very soft. Of course, the merchant girl thought that her voice was very soft, but with her temperament, it was mostly wishful thinking. Everyone present was scared out of their wits by this sudden voice. In fact, the Roman's voice wasn't very loud. At most it was similar to her normal voice, and at most it was a little hurried. But in this silent night, in this silent forest, it was still a little out of place. "Boo. Whoop." Brando covered the girl's mouth with his hand and looked back. As expected, he saw Rady stopped and looked around vigilantly. At this moment, Brando felt like strangling the Roman girl to death. But of course he wouldn't do that because he couldn't bear to do it. Fortunately, Rady only seemed to be nervous for a moment, and then turned back to talk to her companions. Brando sighed in relief. Then, he thought of something and turned back to glare fiercely at Roman. But the merchant girl was still shaking her head unhurriedly and kept making woo sounds. It seemed that she was quite dissatisfied with Brando's actions. Brando almost lost his temper at first, but he immediately felt that something was wrong. Although Romain was a little undisciplined and had the guts to act lawlessly on the surface, he knew that this girl who often smiled like a little fox was actually very shrewd on the inside. Otherwise, how could she not be at a disadvantage? Just as he thought of this, the Nightsong Tiger stretched out a rough hand and pressed on his hand. He was slightly startled. This was even more unusual. As his summoned creatures, the mercenaries of Lopez rarely acted on their own initiative. He raised his head and saw the experienced mercenary's eyes filled with vigilance. Brando let go of his hand, and the Roman also stopped. Not only them, even Rady stopped again. The white-haired young man couldn't help but turn around and look at them. The forest seemed to have quieted down for a moment. Not only the people but even the wind stopped. "What did you hear?" Brando asked subconsciously. He knew that the Roman's senses were far better than normal people. The merchant girl glared at him fiercely, then nodded. Brando's nose twitched, and his heart skipped a beat. There was a strange smell in the air. It was a little pungent, but it was more like a spicy stench. It seemed to be the smell of boiling water from underground volcanoes. The smell of sulfur. Brando's mind flashed with this thought, and he had already unsheathed his sword. He didn't even think about it as it was an instinctive reaction. Those damn disciples of the Black Flames. That bastard who wrote the guide tricked me again. If he had said earlier that there were disciples of the Black Flames, I wouldn't have gotten involved in this mess. He cursed in his mind in an instant. The disciples of the Black Flames belonged to the forces of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders, Goo Worm Lord Myatt. However, they were different from the Goo magicians who played with insects. These dregs of the human race were the bastards that dealt with those fellows in the fiery sulfur river. They were collectively known as the people below. Simply put, they were the demon lords of the Jorgendi Ridge. Brando couldn't help but slap his head in frustration. He should have thought of this earlier. The forest near Erewhon's southern border had always been the territory of the disciples of the Black Flames. However, his attention was focused on the Sage Slate and the strange Grey Wolves mercenaries. For a moment he had forgotten about this common sense. Was this the legendary darkness under the lamp? However, the reason why Brando was so wary of these people was not because they were strong. It was because these bastards were crazy. They were even crazier than the fanatics of the Holy Church. When the battle started, they were probably just short of shouting that they were invulnerable. Moreover, the disciples of the Black Flames had chained up different demons. Although they were fighting together, they each had their own ulterior motives. This should have seriously affected their battle strength. But the creatures under the Jorgendi Ridge had all kinds of strange abilities that were hard to guard against. Moreover, the high-level disciples could absorb the power of the demons and fuse with the demons they had chained up. Brando wanted to vomit just thinking about that disgusting scene. One or two of these monsters would be fine, but if there were too many of them, even a god would not be able to handle it. Brando's first instinct was to run away. However, just as this thought flashed through his mind, there was a gust of wind in the darkness. As a reincarnated warrior at level 130, Brando was all too familiar with this sound. He subconsciously shrunk his neck and sure enough, he saw a black chain with 2 spiked balls flying out from the darkness of the forest. Spiked ball. There's a lord of spiked chains. Brendel watched as the spiked ball tore down a thick tree trunk and flew past Rady and the youth beside him. Even though it did not cause any damage, it clearly scared the 2 youths out of their wits. Brendel felt the roots of his teeth turning sour. In the Jorgendi Ridge's underground purgatory, the Lord of Spike Chains was 1 level higher than the Cerberus. It was a level 29 demon. Previously, when he went to the lava pool area to train at level 30, he suffered a lot from these guys. He did not expect that the shadow of his childhood would repeat itself today. However, what happened next did not give him time to deal with his aching teeth. He saw Rady and the young man turn and run. Brainless idiots. Brando almost jumped up from his seat. How could a level 29 Lord of Spike Chains have such a bad hit? This was obviously a test. He knew all too well about these cunning guests below. He was almost certain that they were facing a scouting party. However, Rady's escape would probably attract the attention of the disciples of the Black Flames. Of course, he did not care if Rady was dead or alive. The problem was that they were heading in the same direction. Brando immediately patted the Nightsong Tiger's shoulder and roared in a hoarse voice. "Go catch those 2 brats. Drag them back. P.S. Please give me some support. Anything is good. Students, my results are really disappointing. I feel really lonely when no one cares about me." Chapter 148. Rady and the other mercenary had already turned around and started running. They shouted as they ran towards the camp. The Nightsong Tiger immediately chased after them. His figure was like a shadow that blended into the darkness of the forest. He was not fast, but he was quiet and practiced. It was as if he was a creature that lived in the darkness. When Brando turned around, the sound of chains dragging on the ground could be heard from the forest behind him. The disciples of the Black Flames have discovered the commotion here. I need to use another method. He furrowed his brows. Amandina and the Roman had already taken out their light crossbows from their backpacks. Amandina stared at the forest nervously. Not to mention the other mercenaries, every one of them gently pulled out their weapons and prepared for battle. "My lord?" Amandina asked hesitantly. Brando shook his head. He had already made up his mind. The development of the situation had exceeded his expectations, and he had to salvage the situation as soon as possible. He put his hand into his pocket, and when he took it out again, he was holding a crystal that was used for illumination. The crystal lit up in an instant. A soft light bloomed from the youth's hand. "My lord?" Amandina's eyes widened. "Brando!" The Roman was also stunned. Everyone's attention was attracted by the light that appeared in the darkness. It was like a fluorescent light in the endless darkness. The light expanded rapidly, but it was quickly thrown away. The fluorescent light drew an arc in the darkness. The arc passed through a forest and landed in a dense thicket. Even though there were layers of cover, the light from the thicket still illuminated a small area nearby. There were 3 humans in black robes with hoods covering their faces. They did not expect to be exposed and were stunned. Amandina could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Beside each of the 3 stood a terrifying creature that was about half the height of a human. It had a pair of goat hooves, horns, and fangs, and was about the same height as a human. The ankles of these creatures were connected to the wrists of the disciples of the Black Flame by a black chain. Their bodies were covered with strange black patterns. Those were the restraining power of contracts and spells. There was no doubt that these were the underworld visitors of Jorgandi Ridge, the lowest level of the pack demons. That high-level pack demon is in the opposite direction. The mercenaries of Lopez behind immediately shouted. As the collective of the most legendary mercenaries, of course, they would have had dealings with the most evil forces in the world. They were already familiar with the habits of these fellows. However, Brando was more familiar with it than they were. As soon as he saw the 3 of them, he raised his hand in another direction. The silver ring on his index finger glowed, and Brando immediately chanted the spell. Os! The airflow was like a line that exploded forward in a visible range. With a loud bang, the surrounding pine trees were instantly snapped and toppled to the outside, and those that blocked the front were all turned into powder. After the hurricane passed, the forest no longer existed, forming an open corridor in front of Brando. The mercenary's eyes were filled with reverence. The noble lady screamed and covered her ears as she squatted down. At that moment there was only one voice in her mind. "He is a wizard. He is a wizard. This young knight is actually a wizard." The Roman lady tilted her head, and as expected, she saw Brando's figure flash, and his whole body blurred for a moment before disappearing from the spot. Only the mercenaries of Lopez were able to clearly see that Brando's speed was at least 10 times faster than his usual speed. It was as if he left a continuous trail of shadows behind him, and then disappeared from sight. "That's the Sun Knight's charge skill," a mercenary behind immediately said. However, they were not the same as those undisciplined third-rate mercenaries. As soon as the mercenaries finished speaking, one of them unsheathed his sword and walked out from the group. He pointed his sword in the direction where the illuminating crystal fell and ordered, "I, Vice Captain Rocco, will take over the command. I order you to immediately attack those disciples of the Black Flame." "Yes, sir." 11 figures immediately rushed towards the 3 disciples of the Black Flame who were still in a daze. On the other side, the charge skill allowed Brando to catch the Lord of Thorns in an instant. This crimson-red demon was standing together with its master, a man wearing a red robe. The Lord of Thorny Chains looked a bit like a large crimson pack demon, but it had a pair of huge fleshy wings and 2 pairs of long horns. Its appearance was more similar to the classic images of demons in medieval legends. Other than that, there were also a bunch of barbed chains around its body. However, this demon seemed to be heavily injured. Not only was it missing an arm, but it was also missing a wing. Brando did not find this strange. Although the Ring of the Wind Empress was only a 10-ounce equipment, its power was definitely enough to kill non-defensive creatures below level 30. Otherwise, it would not be called a small divine weapon. In the game, the only thing that was criticized about it was that its cooldown was too long. As for demon-type creatures, other than the Blade Demon, which was a mid-tier troop, there were no other defense-type creatures. Brando looked at the man again and narrowed his eyes. a high-ranking member of the Disciples of the Black Flame. His figure turned in midair, and a long sword appeared in his hand. Unlike the battle with Buga, he did not dare to hold back. Although the Disciple of the Black Flames was only level 21, the Lord of the Spike Chains was a level 29 demon. White Raven Sword. Brendel swung his sword from top to bottom and activated Power Burst. A wind blade blossomed from his sword. The Disciple of the Black Flames was still checking on the injuries of his contracted demon. He did not expect the enemy to arrive so quickly. The moment he raised his head, the translucent ripple of the sword had already pierced through his chest. Brando was no longer the weak young man he was a month ago. A level 21 character was like a boss to him a month ago, but this disciple could not take a full blow from him. The disciple screamed and flew out with a trail of blood. According to the rules of the game, once the person who signed the contract died, the demon would regain its freedom. But the backlash from the contract would cause the bloodthirsty creature to descend into a mindless frenzy. That's what I'm facing right now. When he landed, he lowered his head and saw a chain sweeping across his back. Ouch! Brando felt a burning pain on his back. My speed is at least 20% faster. Berserk state. Looks like the disciple is dead. That thought flashed through his mind. At the same time, he knew that a layer of skin on his back had been swept away. He could not help but curse. Even though he was cursing, Brendel still grabbed the chain with a backhand. Ignoring the piercing pain in his hand, he flew towards the devil's direction. Even though the Lord of Thorny Chains was a high-level demon, it was a man-made low-level demon in Jorgendy Ridge. It did not have a complete soul and lacked intelligence. Not to mention it was already in a frenzy. It did not expect that its action of pulling back the chain would attract a killing god. Brando borrowed the disciple's strength and pushed his sword forward. The sword had already pierced the disciple's eye. His movements were very smooth, as if he had practiced this action hundreds of times. In fact, he had practiced this action hundreds of times, but that was in the game. The Lord of Thorny Chains, who had its eye heavily injured, raised its head and howled. The low growl echoed through the forest. The young man frowned and lightly landed on the disciple's shoulder. He immediately turned his sword around and slit the monster's neck. Blue blood spurted out. The high-level demon's howl suddenly stopped and turned into a gurgling sound. It struggled and finally fell to the ground. Brando let out a sigh of relief. He first retrieved the experience points without checking if there were any drops. The Disciples of the Black Flames were famous for being poor, so he did not want to deal with them. He raised his head and saw that his subordinates had successfully defeated the other Disciples of the Black Flames. But this did not mean that it was over. He had already noticed that there was a commotion in the forest. Whether it was the direction of the Grey Wolves' mercenaries' camp or the opposite direction. Damn it! He cursed under his breath. At the same time, he ordered his summoned creatures in his mind. Prepare to retreat. Bring those two guys away. He then lowered his head and looked at the huge red monster on the ground. It was on its last breath, but it was not completely dead. Demons were known for their tenacity in the game. They were known as the three most hated types of monsters, along with the undead and plant-type monsters. Thinking about this, Brando suddenly felt that he was unlucky. He suddenly remembered what he had encountered since he came to this world. Skeletons, the golden demonic tree, and these demons. It seemed that he had encountered the big three, not to mention that his main enemy was Madara, which was obviously a group of undead skeletons. Could it be that Mother Marcia was playing a joke on him? He could not help but laugh at himself. But at this time, lines of small, ghostly green text suddenly appeared in Brando's vision. Target creature's contract has been cancelled. Target creature is in an extremely weak state. Condition met. Sign a contract with me? Yes/no. Brendel was slightly taken aback when he saw the rows of notifications. He could not help but shudder, and then shook his head resolutely. Absolutely not. When Reedy and his companions were tossed to the ground, the white-haired youth raised his head and glared at everyone present with his usual arrogance. But when he saw that it was Brando and the others, his pupils constricted and he struggled to stand up. But the Nightsong Tiger pressed one hand on his shoulder and the other on his neck. The oppressive force forced him to bend his body, but he still glared at Brando with his silver-gray eyes. He was like a wolf that had not been tamed. He struggled and growled. So it was you. I knew you were up to no good. Ugh, cough, cough. But Brando did not have time to talk nonsense with him and punched him in the face. The force behind the punch was so strong that Rady could not help but turn his head back and cough out a mouthful of blood. Amandina could not help but gasp. Romaine blinked a few times, thinking that Brendel would lose his temper too. Just like the last time when he was with Freya, but that was in the Golden Tree Canyon. But she was more concerned about Brando's hand. The youth's hand was covered in blood from the battle with the Lord of Spike Chains. Romaine felt a little pain in her heart, but she wanted to go over and help bandage it, but the youth did not let her touch him. The spikes of the Lord of Spike Chains were poisonous. Brendel understood that his constitution was high, and he had no problem resisting the poison. But little Romaine was different, and he did not want to accidentally label this merchant lady as sickly. The Lord of Spike Chains' poison was harmful to vitality. On the other side, the white-haired youth immediately turned his head back with blood at the corner of his mouth. He stared at Brendel with a vicious glare. Brendel also looked at him. The battle just now had attracted the attention of both sides, and now the forest not far away was in a mess. If he did not react quickly, they would probably be stuck there and unable to get out. But even now, they were not necessarily safe. That was why Brando was so angry. Your enemy is not us. If you don't want to die, don't move. He looked at the youth and said coldly. Rady clenched his teeth. He understood that Brando's group was not in the same group as those in the forest. But he was furious. He thought that this bastard was using his power to take revenge. He only explained after punching him. He was obviously teaching him a lesson. But even so, he still thought that Brando was just trying to scare them. Others might not know, but he knew that the Grey Wolves mercenary group was far more than a simple mercenary group. Perhaps others were worried about the possibility of fighting with the Paper Cards mercenary group, but he was not worried at all. He just did not think that those bastards would dare to strike first. Rady spat in his heart, thinking that this country bumpkin was making a fuss over nothing. He raised his head and gave Brendel a disdainful look. Brando looked at the other person and was stunned. It was a girl. Her eyes were closed, and her long black hair framed her pale face under the moonlight. But Brendel was surprised that she did not show any signs of panic even in such a situation. Who is she? The thought flashed through his mind. But at this moment the Nightsong Tiger asked, It's the disciples of the Black Flames. My lord, what do we do next? Disciples of the Black Flames? Rady's heart skipped a beat. Brendel glanced at the mountains in the north and lowered his eyes. Let's go east. The white-haired youth could not help but laugh. He was born in a noble military family, so he was quite knowledgeable. He thought that since the Paper Cards mercenary group was so close to this location, it meant that the sentries on the mountain in the north had been removed. If that was the case, the south would be much safer. Rady was obviously a layman, yet he pretended to be an expert. He laughed in his heart as he thought that it must be hard on his subordinates. Rady obviously thought that Brando was a spoiled brat, but when the Nightsong Tiger attacked, he did not even have time to react before he was captured. It left a deep impression on him. But even though he was laughing, Rady was still worried about the disciples of the Black Flames. He secretly glanced at the mercenary beside Brando and thought that he would not lie. It was not realistic for him to get information from his fellow mercenaries, so he had to find a chance to get something out of this spoiled brat. He thought of this and looked at Brando again. But unlike Rady, the Nightsong Tiger was interested in Brando's words. My lord, have you dealt with the disciples of the Black Flames before? Something like that. Brando casually replied. I've dealt with the high-ranking priests of the disciples of the Black Flames in the northern mountains. He added in his heart. In the game. Oh. The Nightsong Tiger's eyes lit up. High-ranking priests? Ha! Cough cough. Haha, why don't you say that you've met the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders? Rady couldn't help but laugh. The priests of the disciples of the Black Flames are at least at the silver rank. If I'm not mistaken, even Erwin's Imperial Guards would not dare to easily defeat their high-ranking priests. May I ask which army did you meet them in? After he finished, he looked at Brando with contempt. Even if you want to brag, you should come up with a draft. Also, if you want to go to the south, let me go. I don't want to die with you. This guy was really stubborn. After listening to Rady's ridicule, Brando couldn't help but laugh. Not only did I meet one of the 12 patriarchs, I even killed one of them. You won't believe me even if I tell you. What's so special about the 12 patriarchs? When he was at his peak, he was at the level of an oracle knight. In other words, in the tree herders and the unifying guild, there were only 1 or 2 people who could match him. No matter what game it was, the players would only get stronger. However, Brando wasn't in the mood to explain this to Rady. He smiled at him and asked with a dangerous tone. It seems like you still don't know where you stand? Rady choked and realized that he had no right to speak. It didn't matter if the person in front of him was just a fox pretending to be a tiger. He snorted coldly and didn't reply. However, Brando didn't mind him being a mute. He turned around and asked, "Who are you?" This time he looked at the girl. Rady glanced over and turned his head to the side. "My name is Yura, Mr. Knight," the girl said. "You know I'm not a merchant?" Brando was stunned. "I know more. I know that our mercenary group is in danger right now. Sir, you can help us, right?" The girl nodded in acknowledgement and continued to ask, "Yura?" This time it was the white-haired youth's turn to be shocked. Who's that?" Yura asked. Brando was really curious this time. He couldn't help but look at the man again. "How did you know? P.S. Although it's only 1 chapter, it's a lot. 5,300 words. If you want to know what will happen next, please log on to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading." Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 149. How did you know? Brando turned his head and looked at Yura, who was kneeling on the ground covered with a thick layer of needles. He quickly noticed that the girl's hair was a beautiful pure black, and not Amandina's deep black with a hint of purple. A hint of surprise flashed in his eyes. Amandina's purplish hair and eyes probably came from the bloodline that was closest to the Myrnas, the Tyrithians or the half-demons. Even though the Myrnas were long gone, the bloodline that was born between the 2 races had been passed down. After generations of enmity, the bloodline had gradually melted into the vast majority of the human race. The hatred of the past had gradually faded away. But this girl named Yura did not seem to be from this bloodline, even though she had the same black hair and eyes. "I don't know either, Mr. Knight. Perhaps it's a premonition. Pi Conrad's mercenary band and the disciples of the Black Flames have never had any contact, but they appeared together tonight. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, but I'm more willing to believe that this is a premeditated scheme. Mr. Brando, right? I believe that when people are attacked, they would gather together with their own people. Even though we are not worthy of your trust, it's still better than having enemies on the other side. But all of you chose to stay away without hesitation. This is the best way to protect yourselves." Yura closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the battle between the Grey Wolves mercenaries and the disciples of the Black Flames. Her tone was neither fast nor slow. But if we think about it from another perspective, it means that Mr. Brando has analyzed the situation clearly. "You must have noticed that another mercenary band has been tailing us." She spoke with certainty. If that's the case, Mr. Brando still chose to head east. I believe that Mr. Brendel is not a rash person since you can make such a decisive decision. If a truly wise person knows what lies ahead, but still continues to press forward, that is bravery. But compared to this, I'm more willing to believe that Mr. Brando knows the situation clearly. I don't know what lies in the east, but is that the way out? Mr. Brando? As for why I said that Mr. Brando is a knight, she smiled slightly. Because I just happened to hear how the young lady addressed you. Because I was born blind, Lady Martha gave me a better sense of hearing. It's not something to brag about. Yura smiled modestly. Amandina let out a soft ah and looked at Yura warily. Yura raised her head. Even though she could not see Brando's face, she still asked seriously, "Mr. Brendel's help me." "Mr. Brendel, you must be able to help our mercenary group, right?" Brando took a deep breath. If Amandina could be considered a qualified aide, then this girl in front of him was simply a monster. Her intuition told Brendels of the Grey Wolves as Brendel. He looked at Yura's pure black hair, dark brown eyes and light yellow skin. Every detail on her thin, feathery eyebrows seemed to carry the unique aura of a place he was familiar with. I also have a question. Your surname is Huang, right? Brendel asked. Yura could not open her eyes, otherwise they would be filled with shock. She touched her chest and paused for a moment before letting out a sigh of relief. Of course, her small action did not escape Brando's eyes. He frowned slightly as if he thought of something, but Yura nodded in the end. Yes, my surname is Huang. My real name is Huang Yu. I can see that Mr. Brando is very knowledgeable. My appearance can't fool someone who is truly knowledgeable. It's just that I don't want to talk about the past anymore. Mr. Knight, can you let me go on this matter? Brando nodded. He only guessed the girl's real name based on some details of her appearance. After all, there was only one place in the world with such skin and hair color that was so similar to the Han people in the past. It was the Kingdom of the Nine Phoenixes in the desert. It was said that the Kingdom of the Nine Phoenixes was ruled by 9 different races. And there was a legendary high-level sword skill called Sword of the Red Lotus of Hellfire. However, it was only a legend, and many players who went there to try their luck did not find anything. As for Erwin and Cruz, there were many 9 phoenixes walking around like elves from the north. It was not uncommon in this world for people to travel to a foreign land far away from their homeland for reasons of travel, pilgrimage, or simply adventure. Brando touched his forehead and felt that the name was familiar. But he still shook his head at Yura's request. I'm sorry, but we can't help you. In fact, I'll be frank with you. These disciples of the Black Flames won't cause any trouble for your leader. But if Makarov the maned wolf is wise, or if I were him, I'd leave this place immediately. You. Rady raised his head and glared at Brendel as if he wanted to eat him alive. You can't just leave like that. The mercenary document says. But the Night Song Tiger punched him in the stomach, and the white-haired youth bent over in pain. He then shook his head in disdain. Your leader doesn't seem to care about this agreement even now. You have to admit that. Do you understand? Yura nodded. What do you want, Mr. Brando? She asked. Money? Or power? Brando paused for a moment, but he immediately shook his head. I'm interested in these things, but compared to money and power, I don't want to get involved in trouble. Let me give you a hint. The Black Flames mercenaries are backed by the tree herders. Do you know them? Yura and Rady's expressions changed. Why are we being targeted by them? Rady asked in disbelief. Yura's expression changed again and she lowered her head. Amandina poked him from behind and whispered. My lord, the more you scare them, isn't it obvious that you want them to beg for your help? Won't that be the opposite of what you want? Brando shrugged. I don't want to lie to them. He could only explain under Amandina's suspicious gaze. It's not that I can't help them, but I won't get myself involved. I'm just stating this. Then what should we do? The Roman blinked and asked. They have to rely on themselves. Is that even possible? Amandina clearly did not believe him. Of course. Mr. Brando, what should we do? Yura heard their conversation and understood that Brando was reminding them on purpose. She hesitated for a moment as if she was considering whether she could trust him. However, Brando knew that the Tree Herders bomb was definitely not an ordinary bomb. Compared to the Unifying Guild's small operations to subvert countries, the Tree Herders had used their own strength to start the First Holy War. That story was probably a terrifying shadow for most people who lived in this era. Of course, this was a digression. Brando did not have the time nor the inclination to explain how terrifying the Tree Herders were to these 2 rookies. After all, they had grown up listening to bedtime stories about the First Holy War. Yura might be slightly better, but the white-haired young man, Rady, would definitely not have a good impression of such a name. He turned around and saw that the young man seemed to have fallen into a daze. He did not know what to do. Didn't I say? Brando replied. Go and tell your leader to retreat immediately and leave this place. From the current situation, the Tree Herders have their eyes on you. However, they have a habit of being vigilant. Once they realize that you might have discovered their intentions, they will probably retreat and rearrange their plans. This way you'll have one valuable time. As for what to do after that, I think your leader will know what to do. Rather than saying that Brando's analysis was clear and logical, it was more accurate to say that he was reading from a book. Although the strategy guide in his memory had omitted some details, The general direction was very clear. The tree herders had their eyes on the Grey Wolves' mercenaries. As for why, Brando naturally did not know. However, not knowing did not mean that he did not have a solution. He had dealt with the tree herders for as long as he had dealt with the skeletons in Madara. He had plenty of ways to deal with them. Yura and Rady looked at each other. How do we know if you're telling the truth? Rady frowned and muttered softly. I'm not forcing you to believe me. Aren't you being too irresponsible? The white-haired youth snorted. We don't have any obligation to be responsible. Do you understand the current situation? Master is helping you out of kindness. Of course, you can choose not to accept it if you have the guts. Amandina had long found this person annoying. At this time, she could no longer hold it in and spoke sarcastically. After she finished speaking, she suddenly paused. She could not help but look apologetically at Yura, who was kneeling on the ground. I'm sorry, I meant. Don't mind. Yura shook her head. She had been lowering her head the whole time and no one knew what she was thinking. She only opened her mouth and asked, So Mr. Brando still wants to do things his way and leave this place, right? Brando nodded. Even if we ask you to stay, you can't? Brando nodded again. He had his own reasons. He had already gotten himself into trouble with the Unifying Guild. If he had to bear the burden of the tree herders, he would not be able to rest in peace even if he died. But on the other hand, he knew that Byuga and Makarov would not die in this quest. Even though he knew that he did not have the strength to subdue them, he still had to express his goodwill. Even if he chose to leave under these circumstances, he would not be letting down the Grey Wolves' mercenaries. The agreement between the two parties was as fragile as it looked, but if he left, it would be troublesome if he wanted to pick it up again. No matter if it was for the two powerful people or the future Courage quest line, he did not have to establish a good relationship with them. But as a veteran player, Brendel had already weighed the pros and cons in his heart if it was worth risking his life for this little benefit. Mr. Brando, are you willing to let us go? Yura asked again. I didn't intend to capture you. I was actually saving you. Miss Yura, you should understand this. Brando replied. Yura nodded. But aren't you afraid that we will expose you if you let us go? Brando smiled and replied confidently. You won't be able to catch up to us. He wasn't joking. The guide had at least 4 shortcuts and trails in the area. Although the map was a little rough. But it was not a problem for a veteran player like him. Rady glanced at him and did not reply. However, it was obvious from his expression that this unruly white-haired youth didn't believe his words at all. In his heart he believed that he was just bragging. Even though he was shocked by Brando's words, he remembered that this guy had made a fool of himself. What did he mean by go east? He was clearly a layman. This thought seemed to make him feel more at ease. He then thought that he had to persuade Yura to not be fooled by this guy. P.S. What a strong person. I actually managed to rush out a chapter before 12 o'clock. I'll try my best to write more chapters later. Please support me.